Chapter 11:17. But they will still die. Andesha shouted. Brendel looked at her with disdain, dismissing her words. Of course they won't die. He shook his head and exposed her mercilessly. I know that the gods have more than one plan. You don't have to lie to me. The Ring of Ashes has always been stubborn. Everything you've done is just to prove that you're right. As for whether you're right, you're not sure, are you? So, for the sake of your experiment, you've involved countless people who don't know the truth. Don't make your selfish desires sound so righteous. But we might succeed. I might succeed too. Brando revealed a rare cold smile that sent chills down Andesha's spine. Let me tell you a piece of good news. Since you have angered me, I have decided to join the game. Now, the game will be played according to my rules. What are you trying to do? Andesha stared at him as if she was looking at a madman. To prove that you are wrong and I am right, I will first make you accept your failure. Brando replied. No, you can't do that. Do you feel that it is unfair? Brando shook his head. Those who were killed by you and the Silver Queen felt the same way. But I will do what you have done. Andesha finally broke down. She slumped down as if she had lost all her strength. All right, I'll tell you. I'll tell you everything, but please, at least give us a chance. Andesha spoke in a tone that even she could not believe. Brando did not say a word. He could not make such a promise. He only had one goal, and that was to let the Roman live. Perhaps it was selfish. But he did not think that he was noble. If the world had to let some people die in order to let others live, then he would rather fight until the last moment than compromise. Death and destruction were not to be feared. What was terrifying was the loss of faith and perseverance. The flames of civilization were passed down from generation to generation in such glory. Perhaps one day, people would be proud of such a history instead of living in pain and regret. Brando remained silent for a long time, waiting for Andesha's reply. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, but it felt like a century had passed before Andesha spoke with a dry voice. Actually, it's useless even if I tell you, because you won't be able to find them. The Dragon Empress will lead the little girl to the Earth elemental plane, where the elemental barrier is the weakest. She's a gold person and a dragon whose blood has been purified. That's why she can elementalize and enter the elemental barrier. It's impossible for ordinary people to reach there. Andesha suddenly stopped talking. She saw Brando opening a dimensional hole and pulling out a sword. The sword was as gray as a stone. The blade was as wide as a palm and 2 inches thick. There was a saying inscribed on the blade, "The one who wields this sword is the innate master of the earth." The ancient English grammar was concise and powerful. Dozens of characters were written in Gutenberg script in an unusually simple and heavy style. They were connected to each other as if they contained magical power. Brando kissed the blade like a real knight and said softly, "Old friend, please guide me for the last time. Perhaps you still remember the glory of 1,000 years ago. I'm proud to be able to fight alongside you." As he spoke, he threw his sword forward. You. Andesha felt as if there was a thorn stuck in her throat. Halran Gaia let out a soft whimper. It had been sleeping for thousands of years, and the fierce battles had left merciless scars on its blade. It was no longer as glorious as it used to be. It used to control the entire land, because the one who wields this sword is the king of the earth. But the wind and frost had passed, and time flew by. When it reappeared in the world, it had accompanied an ordinary knight from a border kingdom through many roads. Its enemies were no longer great and eternal existences, but the faith on the sword had never faded. It was the Halran Gaia. The elemental laws of the entire world resonated with it. This was the sound of a holy sword. The Halran Gaia suddenly broke apart, and the fragments formed a door of light that floated in the air. Clouds swirled around the door, forming a huge vortex. Andesha looked up at this shocking scene and saw a mountain peak hanging down from the sky. The peak of the Spiral Mountain. Legend had it that it was reflected on the White Tower and opposed to the White Tower. Then this place was. Andesha looked at the other side of the door, and her dark eyes reflected a breathtakingly beautiful scenery. It was a shallow sea with waves as smooth as a mirror. Clouds floated in the sky, and at the end of the line between the sea and the sky, a towering mountain stood alone. New life and death, endless growth. This was the world outside the elemental barrier. Shallow sea. The elemental plane of water. The door of light formed by the Halran Gaia rotated slightly, and gray threads of law fell from it and turned into dust. The fragments of the sword became dimmer and dimmer, like the gaze of an old hero. It had seen many sceneries, and its footprints were all over the wound. It was once held in the hands of the most heroic person in the world. It was the Sword of Swords, the Holy Sword of Gaia. But this was the last thing it saw. Gaia's teachings came from the belief of protection. Nobles protected their citizens, priests protected their believers, fathers protected their families, and mothers protected their children. At this moment, it acknowledged Brando's protection. This was the noblest tribute. A few lines of law landed on Brendel's body, and with a flash, they merged into his body. Brando was stunned for a moment. He discovered that there was an additional description of the earth element in his elemental power. He looked up at the door of light and roughly understood what was going on. The power of inheritance. The Halran Gaia has acknowledged you. A white fox landed beside Brando's feet. She was a little dirty and had a few wounds on her body, but her black eyes were bright. Feel its law well. Perhaps one day you will really become the king of the world. I will. Brando replied, White mist, what happened to the Roman? It is similar to what you understand. Because of Gaia's aura, the soul of the Twilight Dragon in the Roman's body went berserk. It has not fully descended yet, but the Dragon Empress will definitely guide it to happen. White mist stared at the other side of the door of light. My power is not enough to stop her, and neither are you. But perhaps we can work together. The shallow sea is the entrance to the elemental barrier. I have been to this world a few times, and I can guide you. If I kill Frederick, what will happen? You can't kill it. Andesha grabbed the blade of his sword in agitation. Blood flowed from her white fingers, but she did not seem to notice it as she shouted, You promised me. Brendel ignored her and continued to look at the white fog. White mist shook her head. Have you ever thought that even if you kill Frederick, the Twilight Dragon will still descend upon the Roman? At that time, the Roman Empire will cease to exist. Brando fell silent. Andesha also trembled and did not dare to make a sound. You already knew this? He suddenly asked. Do you blame me? No. Brando shook his head. He knew that even if he knew that the Twilight Dragon's will was in the Roman's body, it would still be futile. It was the first time he felt so lost about the future. He thought about the moonlit summer night in Bucci. He thought about everything about the merchant girl. He thought about her amusing leather skirt, her bag, her smooth forehead, and her bright and cunning eyes. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. Brando, no matter what you do, I will stand by your side. Brando, I will become a great merchant in the future. You will. He muttered to himself, no matter who you are, I will save you. I promised you. You really look like that idiot Odin now. White mist suddenly said. Brando shook his head. No, I don't look like him at all. Oh. Why? Because he failed, and I will succeed, I hope so. The man and the fox stepped into the world behind the Gate of Light, leaving Andesha to stare blankly at the Gate of Light. The Gate of Light gradually faded, and the scenery behind it became more and more illusory. But the tree herder's leader suddenly gritted her teeth and rushed in with her hands covered in blood. The gate of light flickered behind her and disappeared. About a few minutes later, Pamela limped over. She looked left and right, all the way to the place where the door of light had disappeared. She sniffed lightly with her nose and finally sighed. "I'm a step too late, my lord, the shallow sea." Among the many worlds of Vaunt, such a word was called Torrigon by the witches, and the dwarves called it the world of the water of all things. It was the home of the elven tree and also the home of the elves. It was recorded in the Pale poem as a mysterious rune that was difficult to decipher with the wisdom of mortals, but humans gave it a definition: the elemental plane of water. Many people dreamed of the shallow sea because it was connected to the river of abyss. It was the place where the fate of mortals rose and fell. In that dream, it was a boundless blue sea with grayish-white promontories rising from the sea, forming a cliff-like scene. It formed a path that led straight to the mountain of storm cessation. At the peak of the mountain, wind elemental dragons circled around all year round. Their breaths formed storms that patrolled the entire continent. Under the mountains, earth elemental energy gathered and formed the last barrier of the elemental barrier. Here, the mountains were suspended in the void. Rock-boring worms often dug through the elemental barrier, causing magic to invade and form monster nests or monster swarms in the wound. This was the center of the earth elemental energy, the stone plane. Brando saw that the endless grayish-white path was now full of traces of battle. The bodies of giant wolves were scattered on the rocks, and crystal fragments were shattered on the ground. In the distance, there was a huge corpse lying on the side of the road. It was a crystal giant, but there was only a hole where its head should have been. This was the shallow sea. The origin of all life, a world that was endlessly born and destroyed. He looked up and saw the sacred spiral mountain and the mountain of storm cessation standing face to face on the white plain under the clouds. He suddenly felt sad. The Halran Gaia had witnessed many things that he had done in this world. Everything started with the ABs, the battles, the adventures, the prosperity of the territory, the expectations on everyone's faces, and the smile of Romaine. But they all turned into fragments and disappeared with the wind. "Did you remember something from the past?" White Mist suddenly asked. "How did you know?" Brando looked at the little fox in surprise. "The shallow sea is the origin of all life. The dying can see their lives here. The memories of mortals, wisdom, and spirituality float in the sea. Water is born from life, and fire gives it wisdom." Brando looked around and found that between the corpses of the giant wolves and the crystal, broken grayish-white rocks rose into the sky. They were suspended in the air as if invisible magic was holding them up. The air was buzzing, and the wind blew across the sky. The clouds were spreading in a certain direction at a speed visible to the naked eye. The center and source of the magic flow obviously came from the direction of the mountain of storm cessation. He looked up and squinted his eyes. "What's going on?" "My lord's ritual has begun. The twilight dragon is descending, and the power of chaos will break through the elemental barrier in a short period of time. That's why the shallow sea has such violent magic fluctuations." A voice came from behind them. It was Endesha. The matriarch of the tree herders clenched her fist and answered with gritted teeth. "This change is not too far in the shallow sea, but in the wound, the largest magic tide in 1,000 years has already arrived. It can be seen first in the Great Glacier and White Mountain, but it will soon sweep across the entire continent." Brando looked at the woman, and a voice echoed in his heart. "The era of war and chaos has begun. P.S. Blackie came to play here yesterday and went out to receive this new bee, so I didn't update. I came back today to make up for it. Speaking of which, I saw the battle between the Warship Maiden in the afternoon finally come to an end. It's really gratifying. It's really a battle between gods, and the players are the ones who suffer. That's why I said we'll see each other in the game." Chapter 11-18. The shallow sea is the first barrier between the elemental barrier and the real world. This is the world of the water elemental. The nature of the water elemental is both stable and lively. It is not as active as the fire elemental, nor as stable as the earth elemental, nor as changeable as the wind elemental. It nurtures changes in tranquility, and is neither static nor unstable. That is why it can sustain life. White Fog's eyes reflected the scenery of the sea and the sky. Clouds floated above her eyelids like mist. She stretched out her claws and pointed forward with her long nails. The grayish-white path extended from her fingertips until it disappeared below the sea's surface. The grayish-white promontory is one of the most magnificent sights in the shallow sea. It is endless, and the end is connected to the wind elemental plane. But if we want to reach the mountain of ceasing storms, we can't just walk down this path. This path leads to an endless world, and its length is also endless. Then what should we do? Brando tapped the ground with the flaming edge. The grayish-white promontory responded with a rock-like sensation, but the flaming edge still could not leave a mark on it. Andesha followed behind him in silence, occasionally looking at him with pity. Sometimes she would show disdain or even hatred, but most of the time she was expressionless and silent. White Fog tapped the ground with her claws and said, "In the shallow sea, there is no substance other than the water elemental. The clouds and sky we see, including this grayish-white promontory, are all made of the water elemental." The water elemental. He bent down and touched the surface of the ground. The rocky surface was rough and cold, and there was even a fine layer of sand. It was just like the headlands he saw in Trondheim and the Sublime Sea. Other than the lack of bird nests and gastropod shellfish between the cracks, there was nothing different about it. You can't feel the difference. White Fog saw his action and replied, "This is normal. Our world is made of the elements, and the elemental world is based on the spirit. The grayish-white promontory is just something we imagined, but it was recorded in legends and myths for thousands of years, and naturally projected into this world. On the other hand, the mountain of ceasing storms and the river of scorching heat do not exist because we believe that the wind elemental plane and the fire elemental plane should be like this. It has accumulated over time in the secular world to form the scene we see today." It wagged its long tail, and its voice was unusually ethereal. "To cross White Cape, it's best to have the natives lead the way. Another way is to get the sea fog lamp. The light will pierce through all the fog and guide us to the other side. Sea mist lamp. How do I get that?" Brando asked casually. "When we get close to the Mirror Coast, I will find a way to attract the lighthouse fish. The sea fog lamp grows on these fish. When the time comes, you can defeat one of them and get the sea fog lamp. Then you can summon the extraditor. It will take us through the shallow sea and reach the storm-stop mountain. Mirror Coast." It was Brando's first time outside the elemental barrier. Everything in this strange world was unfamiliar to him. The shallow sea is not static. Some places are calm, and the bottom of the sea is so clear that you can even see the bedrock made up of the foundation of the world. But some places are full of fog, and sharp-edged cliffs protrude from the bottom of the sea, covering the entire sea. There are all kinds of elemental creatures lurking under the cliffs. The lighthouse fish is just one of them. There are also the Tiramoses, who are a very strange kind of human. They have a special ability to weave light into a path of light and guide their ships to sail in the fog. The Tiramoses are the best extraditors. White Fog scratched the ground with her claws and replied as she recalled, "The lighthouse fish are a bit like a large anglerfish. You will understand when you see them. They live by devouring light and are the greatest enemy of the Tiramoses. However, the light in the sacs on top of their heads is the purest light element. This is also the only external element in the shallow sea. It is the sacred item of the Tiramoses. If you have the chance to find a Tiramoses tribe, you might be able to participate in their trade. The Tiramoses rely on light to travel between different planes. They have many good things. Back then, the Witch Empress obtained a spring of youth from them. A spring of youth. Andesha's hoarse voice came from behind. She muttered to herself, I have never heard of the Tiramoses. They actually have a treasure like the spring of youth and are willing to exchange it. Doesn't that mean they are richer than giant dragons? What are giant dragons? White Fog replied bluntly, the Tiramoses are nobler elemental creatures. However, they are not the noblest among the elemental creatures. The noblest are the light people of Ruka. The light fairies are their kin in ancient times. The light people are the builders of Babel Tower. Very few people know this. Aren't they the divine people? Even in the most glorious era, there were no more than 1,000 divine people. How could they do everything personally? The golden people are the warriors of the gods, and the elemental creatures are the craftsmen and artists. How can the enemies of the former be compared to the enemies of the latter? Andesha looked at White Fog with a doubtful gaze. How do you know so much? Who are you, Your Excellency? White Fog turned around and glanced at her. The decay of the previous generation was not as stupid as you. Decay refers to the degradation of all things. It is a part of the cycle of the world. It does not mean that all things will eventually die. As long as there is light and water, there will be new sprouts in the rotten soil. If you can't even understand such a simple principle, your achievements will stop here. Andesha stared at White Fog as if she was possessed. She was cunning by nature, but not smart. Or rather, going back on her words was a way for her to protect herself. She was also very clear about her disadvantage among the 12 patriarchs. That was why she valued her unfathomable thoughts. But White Fog's words were like a sharp sword that pierced into her heart. Although it hurt her self-esteem, it seemed to have opened a path for her in the darkness. She stood there in a daze, recalling those words. Brando and White Fog were not in the mood to wait for her. The two of them walked away for a while. Brando looked at the world of water elemental creatures. It was a vast sea, with no end in sight. White Cape's jagged cliffs intersected with the waves crashing against the reefs. Lonely clouds and faint shadows hung under the blue sky. This was a unique and beautiful world. He seemed to hear that voice again. It was a somewhat low sigh. Human, you have never seen the shallow seas. You will not understand how great nature is. And now, he finally saw the ebb and flow of this world. The ebb and flow of the tides was magnificent, just like a painting. How long will it take us to find the Termosian, White Fog? Brando asked. Are you afraid that we won't make it in time? White Fog asked. I don't know how the Dragon Queen reached the center, but it will take us a long time to get there. According to Andesha, her ritual has already begun. Brando said worriedly. But when we arrive, her ritual will have just begun. White Fog replied confidently. What do you mean? White Fog raised her head and sniffed. What we call time is the law set down by Lady Martha. But here, outside the elemental boundary, there is no law of time. There are only remnants of the law of time from the prime material plane, but it does not play a major role. It is meaningless to the natives. Only creatures of order like us can use it. Brendel was stunned when he heard that. I don't quite understand. It's normal that you don't understand. Because you still have the logic of time in your mind, the law of time is useful to us. For beings without this logic, it is ineffective here. You can understand it this way. In the eyes of the Termosians, time is eternally still. When we come into contact with them, time will also become relatively slow, or even infinitely close to being still. So you don't have to worry about time. Doesn't that mean that as long as I stay with the Termosians forever, the Dragon Queen's ritual will never be completed? That's just your imagination. Suppose the world is about to be destroyed, but if you stop time from flowing 1 second before the destruction, does that mean the world will never be destroyed? Brando finally understood and nodded thoughtfully. Then maybe we can find a Termosian guide. The Termosians rarely enter the wind elemental plane. The elemental changes there are too active, and it's too dangerous for pure elemental creatures who don't live in that world. Besides, what's the use of bringing them along? It's nothing more than saving a little time on the road. When you meet the Dragon Queen, as long as she gets close to the Termosians, won't the state of time return to the same state? White Mist shook her head. So if you want to use the Termosians to deal with the Dragon Queen and the Twilight Dragon, you'd better not think about it, and Desha caught up with them at this time, but this time she did not speak. She just listened to the conversation silently. Brando finally had the idea of looking for the Termosians in his mind. Putting aside the question of whether or not he could participate in the trade fair with the Termosians, even if he got the sea mist lamp, he would still need to find an extraditor. Although the sea mist lamp itself could guide them out of the shallow sea, the extraditor would always save them some time. How can we reach the Mirror Coast and find the Termosians? He asked. Just walk, White Mist replied. But if there are natives leading the way, it'll be even faster. Brando thought for a moment, and his mind sank into the world of thoughts. A card loomed in the darkness. He reached out to grab the card, and heard Medicia's puzzled voice. My lord. But he steeled his heart and did not answer. He held the card in his hand. The card was painted with a white deer, and on its back sat a fairy playing a flute. Song of Samsara Eternal Song Vi Light 4 Dark 4, Spell, Pay 40 Mana, Night, Summon Malurcha the White Deer, Level, Farron Night Level -10, into the field. When the white deer leaves the field, choose 2 cards from the graveyard and shuffle them into the holder's deck. Maintain, Malurcha the White Deer will be maintained until the reset time of the next day. Birth and Death, endlessly growing and multiplying. Brando displayed the card, and a glittering crystal stag stepped out of the door of light. It was tall and majestic, and its eyes were clear and bright. From its neck to its chest, every muscle seemed to contain endless power. This was a male stag in the prime of his life. It was experiencing the most glorious period of its life. Malurcha's 4 slender hooves clattered on the gray headland. It raised its head and looked around. There was a very human light in its eyes, and 2 drops of tears fell. I never thought I would be able to return to my homeland in my lifetime. It let out a long sigh, and its voice sounded directly in the hearts of everyone present. Is this the shallow sea? The little fairy pinned the flute to its waist and climbed up Malurcha's mane to the top of its head. It grabbed the antlers of the latter with one hand and put the other hand on its eyebrows. It looked as if it was looking into the distance at the horizon. It's so beautiful. It's much bigger than our lake. This little fairy wasn't any different from when Brando first saw it. Instead, its face was much fatter. God knew how much it had eaten in his world. This is your homeland, Malurcha? Brando asked. This is my homeland, Sir Lord, Malurcha answered, its tone full of humility and respect. It's exactly the same as when I left. I've often seen it in my dreams for thousands of years. Unfortunately, I can't keep you here, Malurcha. Travelers can't stop either, Sir Lord. This isn't something to be sad about. To be able to return to my homeland one day is already the greatest fortune for me. It shook its fur and answered, Sir, what orders do you have for summoning me? But right now, I'm just a mount in this card. The main body of this card is actually Lady Myasai. Lady Myasai. That's me. The little fairy pointed at herself proudly and answered, Lady Myasai is amazing. I can play the flute. When bad people hear my flute, they'll lose their minds. If Sir Lord hears my flute, he'll become even more powerful. Brando thought to himself, so you're a bard. The little fairy shook its head from side to side again and looked around. Where's that fierce woman? She's not here, Brando answered. Oh, the little fairy was both relieved and regretful. No one knew what she was thinking. Then, her eyes turned. She had obviously thought of another interesting idea. In fact, if each star in the sky was used to represent an interesting idea in a fairy's mind, then the stars in the entire summer night would probably only be a third of the number. Chapter 11:19. Brando knew that the fairies' interests could be broader than the stars in the sky. Their topics could be longer than the holy river of the elves that flowed within Saint Tassel, and they were just as talkative. If their curiosity was piqued, they could talk for 3 days and 3 nights. This was a big problem that was no less troublesome than nightfall. Brando saw that the little fairy was about to speak again, so he quickly took out a honey ball from his pouch and stuffed it into her mouth with 3 fingers. The little fairy instantly widened her eyes and whimpered in protest, but the honey melted as soon as it entered her mouth. She quickly closed her eyes in comfort, like a cat that had its head stroked. Is there more?" she asked in a muffled voice. "Enough for you to eat from morning to night, but if you don't eat quickly, they'll all melt," Brando answered. These sweets were originally Roman snacks, and most of them had been stolen from the little fat dragon Sheeta. In order to satisfy the little fat dragon's request, Brando had opened a sugar factory in Tonagel, and the merchant girl had unceremoniously given him half of the shares. These shares weren't gold coins, but half of the production. He still remembered the scene of the little fat dragon crying and coming to him for justice, only to be chased out by Hippamra. From this, it could be seen that the evils brought upon themselves were the hardest to bear. The little fairy believed Brando's words and quickly ate faster. Unfortunately, her teeth were small and white, and she couldn't eat much in one bite. She could only use her small tongue to lick around the giant candy ball. Fortunately, this was the simple happiness of fairies. She quickly became so engrossed in it that she forgot about everything else. However, the way she occasionally reached out her little palm and sucked all the honey off her 5 fingers was really unsightly. Malurcha shook his mane and let the little fairy slide from the top of his head to his back. It looked like he was also afraid that this little guy would get the honey on his head. A crystal stag. White Mist tilted her head and looked at Malurcha. She praised, "They are elemental creatures that live in the shallow seas. I didn't think you had a summon like this." And Desha looked at the scene of Brando summoning Malurcha with some reverence. She didn't know much about planeswalkers, but the less she knew, the more she feared this powerful and mysterious power. "Can Malurcha lead us to the Termosian?" Brando asked. Of course, White Fog answered affirmatively. They are the best guides in the mist. Some Telmosians maintain good relations with the crystal stag. They believe that the crystal stag brings good luck. Then can it take us directly to the mountain of ceasing storms? Baiwush shook her head and said, "I don't know. I've only been here 2 or 3 times with the Witch Empress." Brando then turned to Malurcha and said, "We need to find the Termosians. Malurcha, do you have a way to find them?" The tall stag nodded. "My lord, I know where they will appear. The Termosians hunt for elite seals in the Mist Sea near the Mirror Coast. However, they don't appear every day. If we are lucky, they will leave a path of light there. Through the path of light through the mist, we can find the Termosians' route. Don't the Termosians have a fixed foothold? They are the people of the sea. They have large fleets. These fleets move along the path of light, only stopping occasionally on floating ice or islands." He paused. "Actually, my lord, I am not the best guide to find the Termosians. Miss Mayasai is." "Her." Brando turned to look at the little fairy lying on Malurcha's back. The latter was fighting with the sugar ball in her hand and had no time to care about anything else. The fairies have a good relationship with the Termosians. The Termosians are full of reverence for the elemental lord. The fairies are the darlings of the elemental plane. The Termosians think of them as oracles. Sometimes, there are many fairies on the Termosian ships. Malucha answered, the fairies can always find the Termosians. The light boats they weave can pass through the path of light directly and reach the Termosians' foothold. Brando reached out and tapped the little fairy's head. Malucha, can you find the way to the Mountain of Ceasing Storms? White Point can lead to the Mountain of Ceasing Storms, my lord. However, we have to pass through the sea of floating ice. There is a group of killer whales blocking the sea. Only the Termosians can go around them. It's just a group of killer whales. Those are elemental whales. I advise you not to imagine their size, White Mist answered. I was lucky enough to see them once. It was a young whale. When it came out of the sea fog, it happened to be on the left side of our fleet. Its eyes alone were bigger than our entire fleet. Fortunately, this little guy was not interested in us and quickly left with its mother. This lady is right, Malucha answered. Brando was a little lost in thought. Could such a big whale still be called a killer whale? Although the size of a body could not truly reflect the strength of a creature, it could at least show how strong its physical strength was. A creature that could grow to such a size, was it not born with a perfect body? Was there such an existence in this world? He looked at the little fairy. She can weave a light boat. Although it did not look like it. The little fairy, Mayasai, frowned and shook her head to avoid his fingers. She answered in a muffled voice, of course not. I need many sisters to weave a light boat. I can't do it alone. But I know how to call them. If I ask, they will definitely come to help. She glanced at Brando. We fairies are not like you humans. You ask for something in return for everything you do. My sister told me that you humans are all evil, but I still fell for it and was sealed into a card by you. Didn't your sister tell you that you were the one who barged in on your own? Brendel looked at her exasperatedly. That was to save Master Malucha. Did I ask for it? That's not it. The little fairy shook her head like a rattledrum. But the candy you gave was delicious. Much better than honey. My candy is not delicious at all. It's a candy for evil people. My sister said that there is no difference between good and bad candy, but the person who gives the candy is good and bad. Mayasai was very reasonable. Brando could not help but be conquered by her simple dialectical view. He was momentarily speechless. Very good. I'm an evil person. I don't plan on giving you any more candy. He did not expect the little fairy to hug the candy ball and start sobbing before he could finish his sentence. Moreover, the more she cried, the sadder she became. Gradually, she showed signs of bawling. Brendel suddenly felt a sense of guilt, as if he had snatched a Lolita's lollipop and made her cry. He knew that the fairies were simple and not very smart, but he did not expect them to cry so sadly over such a small matter. Don't cry, he said quickly. I was just joking. Really? The little fairy stopped crying and looked at him with teary eyes. Brando felt a headache coming on and quickly nodded. But you have to call your sisters because I need a light boat to find the Termosian. Miss Mayasai, my fiancé is in the wrong hands. I'm very anxious, so the sooner the better, okay? Then do I have candy to eat? Of course. Not only you, but I'll also give your sisters a reward. Brando was not stingy with this kind of no-cost deal. Moreover, these candies belonged to Sheeta and the Roman. The little fairy rolled her eyes. That's not necessary. Actually, they don't like candy. Just give me their share. As soon as she finished speaking, an angry voice rang out in the air. Mayasai, you've been corrupted by the anthropologist. Brendel looked up in shock. He didn't know when, but a fairy in a sparkling dress was floating in the air. 4 pairs of wings as thin as cicadas' wings were fluttering up and down. She was staring at Myeth, who was lying on Malucha's back, with furrowed brows and vertical eyes. Fairies were born with a name and knew every fairy's name from birth. Their names were never repeated. Scholars had been puzzled by this for thousands of years, but they still could not figure it out. Then, fairies appeared in the air one after another. They wore different clothes and looked like they were made of ice crystals. Their hair was also different. Some of them had even weirder hairstyles than the latest trends Brando had seen in the future. However, fairies were naturally lively. They pursued individuality. Every fairy wanted to be different. Mayasai was shocked. She quickly hugged her sugar ball tightly and stared at her sisters in the air. She called out their names one by one. Fuda, Thumb, why are you here? Those who did not know might think that she was born and grew up here, but in fact, Mayasai had never seen her brethren before. It was just that fairies were born to know each other, even if they had never met before. This did not make sense, but it was a fact in Wonde. Humph, the fairies flying in the air stared at Mayasai and replied, "There's a battle here. Her Majesty the Queen asked us to come and take a look." As she said this, her eyes kept glancing at the sugar ball in Mayasai's hand. It was really suspicious of the fairy's real purpose. "This is mine." Mayasai quickly declared her ownership. "Fairies," Brando said, "you heard it just now. We need a light boat. If you're willing to help me, I don't mind exchanging honey with you. I know how to weave a light boat too." Mayasai quickly jumped up. "You don't have to ask them for help. You can't do it alone." The fairies chattered. "Many people are needed to weave a light boat. All of us have to participate. Can you give each of us a reward?" The leader of the fairies asked. "1 candy each." The other fairies actually sang in unison. "2 for each," Brando replied. "2 for each," the fairies sang joyfully. "That's my candy." Mayasai was very sad, but she quickly regained her spirit and said, "I want to weave a light boat too." "Then I'll give you 3, Miss Mayasai." Brando secretly told her through the telepathic link. Mayasai immediately smiled and looked at Brando with a kind gaze. At this moment, she felt that her lord was the best human in the world. It seemed that her sister's words were not entirely correct. And Desha looked at the exchange with her mouth agape. The elemental world was in turmoil. Rocks rumbled down from White Cape, and then were lifted up into the sky by invisible magic. There seemed to be an upheaval in the direction of the mountain of ceasing storms, and this upheaval would affect the entire world through the elemental plane. It might even completely change the original appearance of this world. But the fairies, who had been promised happiness, turned a blind eye to this. As they worked, they even sang, "The fairy's ship, beautiful and exquisite. It's like a floating light, like a star. The fairy's ship, light and small. It passes through the clouds and through the straits." The elemental world was the fairies' home. If the shallow sea was destroyed by the arrival of dusk, then they might lose their home. But the fairies' seemingly heartless optimism made Brando sigh. He looked up at the fairies forming a circle in the air. The elemental stars gathered in their hands, forming threads of bright light. Then they gathered together and quickly formed the outline of a ship. At first, he was worried that the ship made by the fairies would be a pocket-sized boat only suitable for them. But he quickly calmed down. Although the ship was not big, only the size of a sampan, it was at least enough for him and Malucha. At this time, he remembered the previous topic and suddenly turned to White Mist. Why are they called killer whales? Isn't there a species with the same name in the material world? White Mist was stunned for a moment before replying, because that's what the Termosai call them. When it's hunting season, they will even hunt whales. They can hunt those whales. Brendel was a little surprised. How strong would the Termosian be if they could hunt those whales? That's their secret. White Mist seemed to have read his mind and explained, they're not that strong. They're just born with the power of the elemental realm. They're not that strong. They're just born with the power of the elemental realm. Brando muttered to himself. He finally realized that what he saw was actually just a corner of the world. Then will there be a sage in the Tremosai tribe? Chapter 11:20. The Tremosai have a long lifespan, but most of them can't live through childhood and adulthood. Like other elemental creatures, a disease caused by magic erosion spreads among them, causing great trouble to the tribe. Moreover, the Tremosai will regularly sail beyond the elemental barrier to hunt in the chaos. Adults and young individuals often die in the long-term hunting. A few individuals with a long lifespan will become shamans or wise men, guiding the future direction of the clan and tribe. The light ship sailed in the fog. The light from the ship broke through the fog, illuminating a dozen meters ahead. The water was dark, like a mirror. The mirror reflected a steel cable that seemed to have turned white under the high temperature, but it was actually a fluorescent beam of light. It passed through the fog from the left side of the ship, shot out from an unknown place behind the fog, and disappeared into the churning fog in front of it. That was the light path of the Tremosai. To ordinary people, it was just a beacon made purely of the elemental law of light, but the fairies and Tremosai could use it to teleport to many different worlds. White Mist stood at the bow of the ship, her dark eyes reflecting the fog and light, looking both dense and sparkling. The light ship of the fairies was a little like the boat of the elves. It was flat and long, like a leaf, with a long leaf stalk extending from the stem. A lantern hung on it, but there was no fire in the crystal lamp, only floating light, as if a group of fireflies were trapped in it. She stood above the lantern, her claws tightly grasping the leaf stalk, standing steadily, and said, "Most of these elders have the power of the sage realm, but for the Tremosai, such wise men are very rare. Usually, there are only one or two in most clans. Only one or two elders in each clan." Brando asked, puzzled. This was a race that was born with elemental grade. Even the dragons would have more than one or two sages, right? He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. He asked this question because of the sage realm and the perfect body, especially the latter was also an unsolved mystery in the game. The players relied on the war slate to achieve the silver body, but it was a trick after all. However, although many people wanted to find a more perfect way, there were too few records of the perfect body in the game. According to the official statement, it was the path to becoming a god, and it was not so easy to achieve. The players once hoped to find hope outside the wound. After all, everyone knew that there were many powerful and strange races outside the elemental barrier. Many of them had the power of gods, but how many could really reach the elemental barrier? The players went to the fire elemental plane, but that was only a dungeon quest. Now that he finally had the chance to touch this world, he naturally did not want to waste this opportunity. However, he did not expect the White Mist's answer to disappoint him. How can the path of the sage be so easy to walk? It is even more so for elemental creatures. Most elemental creatures can never set foot in the realm of gods because they lack the power of blood. This is the case for the Tremosai. But the real meaning of the existence of the elders of the Tremosai is not their strength, but their wisdom. The elders are the lights of every clan and tribe. For the Tremosai, the sage is like a big book full of wisdom. The Tremosai themselves do not have a written language. They pass on knowledge through knots and oral communication. Sometimes, the accidental death of an elder means the loss of inheritance, or even the survival of a tribe. So you must maintain the necessary respect when facing them. They don't have a written language. Brando thought that such a powerful race should be highly civilized and developed, but he did not expect them to be so ancient that they seemed to be a marginal race forgotten by the world. The Tremosai are very reclusive. You will understand when you see them. Other than necessary transactions, they rarely come into contact with the civilized world. And there are very few things that are useful to them. They themselves have great power. The Termosai attribute this power to the gift of the Holy Spirit. They do not need magic items or machinery. Usually, the only things we can trade with them are pure elements, ancient runes, and everything related to the rules. Then what do we use to trade with them? Brando asked. White Mist turned around and glanced at him. I am talking about the situation of ordinary people. As for you, you are a little different. As for how different you are, you will know later. Brando said no more. The fairies sat around Melurch's back, chattering and greeting him. Because they were the protectors of the sacred forest, the crystal stag was also a sacred and noble creature in the shallow seas. They were rare and friendly, and were the fairies' natural allies. A group of fairies and a stag took up most of the weight of the small boat. For the sake of balance, Brando had no choice but to not sit next to Endesha. He held the flaming blade, the tip of the sword pressed against her chin, in case this cunning lady had any other ideas. But Endesha's attire was a little too advanced. There were only a few vines in front of her chest that extended up her strong abdomen. It was like an evening gown with a deep V-neck. The thick vines could only cover the most private parts of a woman. Most of her full breasts were exposed, revealing a large area of beautiful but unhealthy snow-white skin. Her back, her delicate shoulders, and the parts that connected to her slender neck were all bare. Her beautiful collarbone was exposed under her neck. She looked as if she was sitting naked next to Brando. Endesha didn't care about it herself, but this extent made the latter feel a little awkward. Brando felt a little dizzy. He tried to use the flaming blade to force Endesha to sit away, but the woman seemed to sense something. She looked surprised. She licked her thick purple lips thoughtfully and unconsciously moved closer to Brando. This way, her fleshless waist and delicate skin were almost completely pressed against Brando's arm. The latter felt his scalp tingle. He understood what this cunning woman was playing. He said in a low voice, "Even here, Aroma can still feel my orders." Endesha seemed to have been pricked by a needle and bounced back. She turned her head to stare at Brando, her dark eyes almost spitting fire. Brando stared at her with his sharp white teeth. "You should know that letting you on the ship is already the biggest concession I can make. That's because I can lead you to Gwendolyn." Anne Shad said hatefully. "That's also because you know that only by following me can you find her and join forces with her. I don't care what you think, but you better not waste my time." Brando said coldly, "Or I'll make you understand." Endesha gritted her teeth as she listened to him, but she couldn't say a word. She didn't know why, but she had a feeling that this young man in front of her knew her better than she did. His gaze was as sharp as a knife, able to cut open her heart and guess her thoughts at any time. This feeling made her feel a chill in her heart. She recalled the time when she was plotted against by this young man in the loop of trade winds. That time was similar to now, but the difference in strength between the host and the guest was more disadvantageous to her. She silently closed her mouth. She had made up her mind to follow him for another reason. She wanted to ask about the loop of ashes, but the white mist might not answer. The ship of light cut through the mist, sailing on the sea at a moderate speed, but Brando knew that speed was meaningless here, because the distance on the path of light could be very far or very close. Sure enough, not long after, the fairies flew off Melurch's back, cheering. He turned back to look and saw a faint outline appear behind the mist. When the outline became clear, he saw that it was an iceberg floating on the sea. They'd arrived. The fairies flew off Melurch's back one by one, flying into the mist ahead and quickly disappearing. But the ship of light was still moving forward slowly, and a bridge gradually appeared in the mist. Two huge teeth of some unknown monster were inserted into the water, forming the bridge pilings. There were planks covered with ice on top, and two chandeliers hung down from the huge teeth, glowing behind the mist. Brando saw a strange humanoid creature standing on the bridge. It was short and plump, a little like a dwarf, but it looked like a large bowling pin. It had a broad body and a small head. Its skin was smooth like a seal's, with a thick layer of fur and a thick layer of fat. There were obvious wrinkles between its neck. When the ship got closer, he noticed that the creature had no facial features. Its skin was brownish-blue, and its face was painted with some strange white patterns using a special powder. It looked a little like a concentric circle. At first, Brando thought that it was its eyes, a one-eyed man. The moment he saw the creature, Brando knew that it was a Termosian. He'd seen many strange creatures in the game, but none of them were more diverse than elemental creatures. The Termosian wore a long robe. This robe was not much different from the ones Brando was familiar with, but the patterns on it were simpler, with some red wavy lines. The creature also wore a hood to cover its bald head. Although it had no eyes, Brando could feel that it was sizing him up. A few fairies landed on its shoulders. They were the fairies that had left the ship earlier, but Brando noticed that a few of them were missing. He didn't know where they had gone. The ship of light slowly approached the bridge. The Termosian standing on the bridge raised its hand, and the ship of light rose from the water. Water flowed down from the bottom of the ship like a waterfall. The ship of light rose until it was level with the bridge. The Termosian looked at him and Endesha and opened its mouth to say something. Although it said it opened its mouth, the Termosian didn't actually have a mouth. It just made some sounds. Brando didn't know where the sound came from. He suspected that it was some kind of psychic ability, because the creature's voice seemed to be transmitted directly into his mind. But he did not understand the meaning of the words at all. He only heard a gurgling sound, like a series of bubbles rising from the bottom of the water. The white mist turned its head and translated for him. It says it welcomes you. It says that you are an important guest from afar. Brando hurriedly returned the greeting, and the white mist conveyed his message. The Termosian seemed to be very happy. It hurriedly turned its body, indicating that they should disembark first. Brando jumped off the ship, followed by Endesha. Then Brando saw the Termosian bow to Malurche. The natives living in the shallow seas were all full of respect for the crystal stag, a sacred creature. Are the Termosians all so hospitable? Brando couldn't help but ask the white mist, a little surprised. No, as I said, they are very reclusive. The white mist shook its body, shaking off the water on its body. But didn't I tell you that you are their important guest? But I've never seen these Termosians. They've never seen you either. But you're a planeswalker. That's enough, the white mist answered. After Malurche also disembarked from the ship, the short and fat Termosian waved its fat hand. Brando then noticed that it only had 4 fingers, but it was as nimble as a human's. The ship of light instantly turned into specks of starlight and dissipated. The Termosian seemed to be born with the ability to control the light element. But what was surprising was that they were actually natives living in the water element plane. It turned its head and said something to Brando. It asked you to come with it. There may be a wise one who wants to see you. But before that, you have to bathe and change, the white mist answered immediately. Brando nodded. This was a universal body language, so there was no need for the white mist to translate. 2 people, a deer, and a fox walked along the bridge. The short and fat Termosian walked in front with a lantern. The lantern's light shot far into the fog. Brando continued with his previous question. What's the relationship between the Termosians and planeswalkers? The Termosians and planeswalkers have nothing to do with each other, the white mist answered. But do you know what kind of people are most popular in the remote countryside? It's the traveling merchants. In places where resources are scarce, merchants who can bring what the villagers need are often the most popular people. You're saying that planeswalkers are like that? Brando understood. Planeswalkers were powerful beings who could freely travel between worlds and planes. It was not surprising that they had all kinds of treasures from different worlds. But he thought to himself that although he was a planeswalker, he was at best a novice who had just started out. He did not have anything valuable on him. Or perhaps the Tremosians were also interested in the cards of fate. But that thing was also very important to him. Even if he really wanted to trade it, not many would be willing to do so. Unexpectedly, the white mist shook its head in disdain. The Tremosians don't want those things that you mortals think are precious. They have very few opportunities to trade with planeswalkers. Every time they do, they will cherish it. Besides, they may not have met a real planeswalker for nearly 1,000 years. Then what do they want? Brando could not help but raise his voice. The Tremosian turned to look at him and nodded in a friendly manner. They want the creation of elements and laws. The light and water elements produced by your land cards, and the resources provided by the cards in your world are what they need the most. Can this be traded? Brando's eyes widened. He was really a complete novice when it came to the inheritance and knowledge of planeswalkers. Of course, the white mist looked at him disapprovingly. This is a world built by the mind. Didn't I say at the beginning? Brando was silent. After the previous series of battles, there was not much light and water elements left in his elemental pool, and the creation of Iroma's cards had almost used up all his remaining resources. According to the white mist, now he could only hope that the Tremosian ticket was not too expensive. Chapter 11:21. The dense mist slowly rose to the roof with the hot air, licking the smooth ice surface. The Tremosi's ice-building skills were extraordinary, at least far beyond their ability to build tents. Every piece of ice fit together seamlessly, and one could not feel the uneven surface at all. Brando soaked in the hot spring and looked at the dense mist. Just as White Mist had said, the Tremosi who led him here first brought him here to bathe and change his clothes, and then arranged for him to meet with the sage. After all, meeting with the sage was a sacred ceremony for the Tremosi. He had thought that there would be no environment for bathing on this floating ice, and that he would most likely have to take a stimulating ice bath. For the Tremosi who were born with elemental rank power, there was no difference between taking an ice bath and taking a warm one. But when he arrived, he discovered that there was a hot spring in the middle of the igloo built by the Tremosians. Naturally, there was no geothermal heat on the floating ice. This hot spring was most likely created by magic, and the Tremosi did not need to maintain such a hot spring all the time. This hot spring and even this igloo were most likely specially prepared for him. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but feel a little flattered. He knew why the Tremosi respected him. For a moment, he could not help but worry that the Tremosi would be angry when they found out that he did not have many resources to trade with. There was a stone basin in the corner of the igloo, and the sprites lit meditation incense in the stone basin. The incense had a mysterious smell, and it rose from the ashes into the mist. The fog in front of Brendel's eyes seemed to have turned into an illusion, presenting a bizarre scene in front of him. Scenes after scenes replayed in front of him, as if he was reliving his experiences after he transmigrated. He saw the battle in the loop of trade winds. The enemies he met in that battle were far from the most ferocious, but that battle was the one that left the deepest impression on him. At the same time, it was also the most difficult battle. Even the battle in Ampere Seal, the confrontation with the Empire, and the battle with Her Majesty the Queen were far less dangerous than that. He couldn't help but touch the scar on his cheek. This scar was left behind during the battle in the loop of trade winds. There were also scars on his chest and arms. These were the scars from many battles. Although there were many ways to completely remove scars and wound, Brando didn't want to waste the effort. He wasn't like some perverted nobles who saw scars as medals, but he simply didn't think it was necessary. With a splash, he stood up from the water. The water droplets on his body naturally rolled down his well-proportioned muscles and instantly evaporated. He spread out his arms and draped a gray robe over his shoulders. The style of the robe was no different from the robes worn by the Tremosians. The fairies outside the igloo seemed to have noticed the changes in the igloo. They flew into the igloo and looked at Brando curiously. They flew around him 2 or 3 times before landing on his shoulder while chattering. They held spices in their hands and carefully sprinkled them on Brando's body. Brando's nose immediately smelled a strange fragrance. He was slightly shocked, and a system prompt immediately popped up in front of his eyes. Experience gained, 17334. This was exactly 1% of his total experience. Brando immediately understood what the spices were. Thoughts of meditation. This type of spice was said to come from a certain elemental whale in the shallow seas. Its effect was to clear one's mind and allow one to examine oneself. According to the players, it directly increased experience. However, Brando had only seen thoughts of meditation that was made into incense. 1 stick could be effective for 1 minute, and every second gave 1% of the experience of the level. It was the first time he had seen something as extravagant as these fairies. The experience prompt popped up a total of 3 times, and Brando's Templar Knight and Guard of Frost Earth had risen by an entire level. How extravagant, he couldn't help but think. "Are you bringing me to see the Wise One now?" he asked. "The Wise One wants to see you," the fairies answered in unison. They were clearly saying the same thing, but they all said different things. Their voices were also chattering, and it was quite cheerful. Brando put on a shawl woven from sealskin. This was one of the necessary etiquette for meeting the Wise One. Of course, he didn't know about it, but with white mist around, he wouldn't make a mistake. He walked out of the igloo. White Mist and Malurcha were already waiting outside. Mayasai curled her body into the crystal stag's mane. She had been in the shallow seas for a long time, and it looked like she wasn't used to the climate here. Brando raised his head and looked into the distance. This Tremosian port was called the Port of Everwinter. Although it was built on a piece of floating ice, it wasn't small. It didn't look like a temporary foothold like White Mist had said, but more like a permanent city. At least Brando could see sea walls, bridges, streets, and other permanent structures. Light ropes passed through the air above the huge floating ice, passing through the clouds and mist. In the distance, there was a gray sky and a stormy sea. Ever since they entered the Sea of Fog, the shallow sea had changed. It was no longer as gentle and calm as before, but had become restless and restless. He saw the Tremosian fleet in the port. It was dark and looked a bit like the Vikings' dragon-headed warships, but bigger and more spectacular. He also saw some Tremosians gathered in the square. There weren't many of them, but there were at least 20 or 30 of them. These elemental creatures were rather indifferent, as if they didn't care about the visitors at all. Other than the occasional gaze he could feel, most of the time, he didn't feel anyone checking him out. Other than the fairies, there were fairies everywhere in the camp, and they seemed to outnumber the Tremosians. Brando didn't know whether this was normal or not, and he didn't ask White Mist. He just thought that the fairies liked to live with the Tremosians. What's more, weren't the fairies who had lured him here earlier also residents of this place? The curious fairies hid in various places and quietly looked at this group of uninvited guests. They pointed at them curiously and expressed their opinions. Most of them were like, "Is this a human? How did they come here? I heard that humans are divided into men and women. Is she a man or a woman? What's that little white thing?" And so on. The little white thing, White Mist, saw Brando coming out and jumped on his shoulder. "These little things are so annoying. It's not their fault." Brando replied casually. The fairies were always curious, it was their nature. But most of them didn't mean any harm, although a few forest fairies liked to play pranks. But he immediately stopped himself. He saw a rare fire fairy. There was a square not far away. Of course, this square was not like a human square. It was often either a fountain or a statue. The square of the Tremosians was their place of worship. There was a stone pillar here, and the pillar was tied with thick ropes. The ropes were full of knots, and there were different patterns painted with white dye. To the Tremosians, these knots were sacred, representing the most important events that the clan had experienced in the past. Of course, only the wise could explain their origins in detail. And the sprite was sitting on the top of the stone pillar in the square. Although the stone pillar was not considered a forbidden place for the Tremosians, the little one who dared to sit on the most sacred place of the Tremosians was still worthy of attention. The little one had wheat-colored skin, short flame-like hair, and a bare upper body, wearing a pair of thin trousers and bare feet. His eyes shone like gold. A belt went through his shoulder and connected to the other side of his waist, where a two-handed sword was hanging in the scabbard. Of course, the sword was only about the length of Brando's palm. But a fire fairy who used a sword was rare. No, it should be said that fire fairies were rare. Fire fairies were the subjects of Forsyth. They were arrogant, smart, and had little curiosity. They were also very wary of humans. They were considered an anomaly among the fairies. And it was said that most of the fairies were female, and only the fire fairies were male. They usually lived in hot flames and rarely went to the outside world, let alone the shallow sea. There was no fire elemental that did not hate water. This is interesting. Brando glanced at the little fairy. The fire fairy seemed to have noticed them, but he just tilted his head and looked at them, then turned his attention away. They did not like humans, and they were not as curious about foreign things as other fairies. In fact, the subjects of Forsyth were a little cold. They were not as passionate as fire elemental fairies. You noticed that fairy too? White Mist stood on his shoulder and asked. Brando was following the group of fairies who led the way in front of him through the camp. He nodded and asked, "What is it?" Pay attention to his scabbard. Isn't it similar to the scabbard of the flaming blade? You know that Odorfice is a fire elemental holy sword. The scabbard means that he has a part of Odorfice laws. This little guy might be a direct descendant of Forsyth. He's a fairy prince, White Mist explained softly. Fairy prince? Brando was stunned. His understanding of fairies was limited to their nature. In fact, very few people had a deep understanding of the organization of these elemental creatures. Even in the game, not many players knew about the Termos. Are fairy princes very common? Common. White Mist looked at him, a little speechless. Very rare. The royal fairies rarely appear outside, let alone the subjects of Forsyth. You have to be careful later. This Termos camp might be a little unusual. Brando nodded silently. At this time, the fairies had separated in front of him and lined up in 2 rows. Brando stopped and saw a huge tent in front of him. However, this tent was not like the crude huts he had seen along the way. It was more like a palace, supported by 8 giant beast teeth. It was 20 to 30 meters tall, and a row of stairs made of 2 opposite smooth beast teeth extended from the entrance of the tent to his feet. Brando looked up and saw the guide he met on the trestle not far away. Of course, he could tell from the tattoos on the guide's face. After all, to him, the Termos looked almost the same. There was a slight difference in height, and he could tell that they were adults and juveniles. The only difference was the tattoos on their bodies. Brando could not even tell the gender of the guide. He once wondered if the Termos really had gender. However, White Mist told him that although the Termos were elemental creatures, they still had gender differences. They even needed to form families to reproduce. Although others could not tell the gender of the Termos from the details, there was a simple way: the female Termos would not paint their faces with tattoos. Furthermore, the tattoos on the Telmosian's face were not a mark of distinction but a symbol of status. According to White Mist, the Tulmosian who led them here had concentric circles of tattoos on his face, indicating that he was at least one of the elders of the clan. It was only then that he realized that the Tulmosians had sent an elder to lead the way for him. It was only then that he saluted the other party. While human etiquette was not commonly used in many worlds and planes, the meaning expressed in the gesture was the same. That elder also bowed to him and then said something strange. He said that the wise ones had been waiting inside for a long time. White Mist replied. Just go in. Brando asked as he looked at the half-closed curtain of the tent. Of course. The Termos do not have so many red tape. That's not much. Of course, Brando was too embarrassed to say that out loud. He stretched out his hand and lifted the curtain. Then, he was completely stunned. In the not spacious tent, there were 3 people standing from left to right. The one on the far left was a woman. She was tall and slim, but she had a graceful and luxurious temperament. She wore a silver crown on her head and wore a silk robe with the unique temperament of elves. She held a scepter in her hand, but her whole person was not real, but a virtual image projected by magic. Brando knew this woman. She was the queen of the tree elves, the mother of the little elves, whom he had met once on the evergreen walkway. Beside her was a woman with an even colder expression. She had short hair and wore a simple gray robe. There were no decorations on her body. Even the belt that tied her robe was only a long linen rope. Brando was familiar with her attire. The ascetics from all over Wonde looked just like this. But compared to her attire, Brando was more familiar with her. She was Eloranta, the only human sage on the land after 1,000 years of the War of the Holy Saints. As for the third person, a little fairy with a laurel crown on her head, Brando almost ignored her. After all, compared to the previous 2, this little fairy whom he had never seen before could not attract any of his attention. But before the sage and the elven queen spoke, the little fairy was the first to speak. And she was not even speaking to Brando. She stared at Malurcha, who was beside Brando, and said, Mr. Malurcha. Brando was stunned. Malurcha was also stunned. He asked blankly, Rose. Chapter 11:22. No, you're not Rose. Malurcha raised his head and stared at the fairy who was floating in the air not far away with eyes that seemed to be covered with a layer of ice. The latter was so lazy that it seemed like she would never wake up. Her eyes were calm, as if there was a deep lake in them. They were dark blue with a hint of green. They were completely different from the lively and curious eyes of the other fairies. She always gave people a feeling of calmness and indifference. She heard Malurcha's words and bowed to him gracefully. I am Tata Talamus Thumb, the protector of the ice fairies. Rose is my sister, Mr. Malurcha. As she spoke, the north wind was blowing from the top of the tent. Snowflakes fell from the gaps and disappeared on the ground. You're Rose's sister. Malurcha said in surprise. Rose, the fairies' lives are short and long. Rose's life has already continued in this world in another way. Birth and death, the cycle of life is endless. This is the will of the shallow sea. Tata looked at Faith, who had wrapped her mane around herself and was looking at her curiously with her head tilted. The pair of emerald blue eyes on her face shone like gems. It was exactly the same as her sister's eyes when she looked at her 1,000 years ago. The latter was always so innocent and lively, full of curiosity about everything in the world. She nodded slightly and said, but I still have to thank you for taking care of her. I can feel her attachment to you, Mr. Malurcha. Malurcha lowered his head and scratched the ice with his hooves. He seemed a little excited. It took Brendel some time to figure out what had happened between Mias and Marlowe. He couldn't help but think back to the sacred forest in the darkness. It was as silent as winter, and the branches of ice and snow spread silently. There was no sign of life, but there was a noble life that was willing to risk its life to protect it. It was because the memory of a little fairy named Rose was buried there. It was silent under the snow. Although time flew by, its memories of the past often became clearer. There seemed to be a low voice singing in the wind. The fairies were singing in a low voice. Don't feel sad for the dead, for life is endless. Don't cry for the dead, for new sprouts will always grow on the rotten soil. After the end of all things, comes the new birth of the world. Traveler, please go on, the whispers in the wind accompany you and me. Brando looked at the fairy lady in silence. He believed that this very unique fairy lady had not led them here to confirm news of her sister. The appearance of the elven queen of the Ring of the World and the sage Elaranta's projections explained many things. This was an unexpected meeting, and the key was why he was the protagonist of this meeting. Furthermore, the lifespan of fairies was short, of course. Light fairies with elemental rank like Tanya were an exception, but from the description of this fairy lady, she should have lived for thousands of years. Even as the light fairies with the longest lifespan, this was outrageous, not to mention that she wasn't one. Brendel could not help but think of Elaranta. As a mortal, this sage had obviously lived for too long. Brando turned his head to look at White Mist on his shoulder and saw that the latter was frowning slightly. He looked at the fairy lady again. Tada's expression was still indifferent, as if she would not take the initiative to speak if he did not speak. Brando had to ask softly, Miss Tilias, are you the one who wants to see me? Are you the sage of the port of Everwinter? Tada spoke softly. Her voice was ethereal and calm, as if it could soothe the anxiety and uneasiness in people's hearts. I am the protector of Quilinthe. I came here 1,000 years ago because of an agreement with Sir Odin. After Master Manlin left, I am the only sage here. Quilinthe is in the south of the shallow sea. That is the home of fairies, Mr. Brando. She added. You know me. Brando immediately realized that he had asked a silly question. Sure enough, she looked at the elven queen and did not answer. Unlike the other fairies, she did not seem to like to talk. She was so quiet that it made people curious. Brando frowned again and asked, what is the agreement between you and the Dark Dragon? Can the sage of the Termosai people also be non-Termosai? White Mist on his shoulder answered his question. She replied softly, the most important thing is the inheritance, but very few sprites will become wise ones. Her words were self-evident. With the sprites' cheerful personalities, it was obvious that no one would think that they were reliable. Even Lady Tanya, whom he met among the Bugas, was full of all kinds of mischief ideas. But this fairy lady in front of him was clearly different. Just by standing there, she gave people a different feeling. It was as if she was a thick book, quietly opening its pages for people to read. Her calm eyes revealed the aura of knowledge and wisdom. Lady Turlias is the blessed of the crystal. Her memories include 1/3 of the knowledge in the World Library. In fact, she is not only the sage of the port of Everwinter, but also an omniscient sage of the entire Termosai world. The Elven Queen's projection smiled and explained to Brando. Brando hurriedly nodded at her, but then he saw a little girl poking her head out from behind the Elven Queen. She grabbed her mother's skirt with one hand and pressed her lower eyelid with the other, making a face at Brando. Hypocrite, you betrayed me. The naughty little princess angrily shouted. Emily. The Elven Queen could no longer maintain her dignity. She angrily scolded the future Princess White, which was now the nickname of the naughty little princess, and angrily chased her to the back. Go back to your room. Guards, take the princess away. Brando's forehead was immediately covered in cold sweat. But what really affected his mood was not the naughty little elf, but the Elven Queen's words. He could not help but take a few more glances at the quiet fairy lady. The World Library was the treasure trove of knowledge in Ebabel Fortress. After the Tower of Babel fell apart, the knowledge and inheritance in it were completely lost on the earth. For thousands of years, some people might occasionally find a word or two in it, and the knowledge they obtained would be unprecedented, and they could even build a new civilization on the earth. Two men had only obtained the inheritance of the elemental circle from a fragment of the war slate, and thus established the modern magic system. He could be said to be the mentor of all elementalists and wizards, but the knowledge he had was not worth mentioning in the era when Babel Tower still existed in the modern world. But now someone told him that there was still someone in this world who had 1/3 of the knowledge in the treasure vault. And the person who held the key to the knowledge vault was, in his impression, an individual of the fairy race who was not very smart, an ice fairy. When he looked at the fairy lady again, it was as if he was looking at a library floating in the air. This library was probably more majestic than the white tower of the silver bugas. It included all the knowledge and inheritance on the earth today. It was even more than that. "I recognize you." White Mist suddenly jumped down from Brando's shoulder at this time. She landed on the ground and looked up at the others. White Mist stared at Miss Totatilla's thumbs and muttered to herself, "You are the Holy One." The fairy lady nodded quietly. "I am one of the 7 Holy Ones, Madame Mosikisis White Mist, one of the ancient saints of the witches." "I don't remember that clearly," White Mist replied. "Let me think, you are Alanta." "Who are you?" "In that era, I was called Leia." The Elven Queen replied. "It's you. You are the daughter of the great druid of the past." White Mist looked at her with sparkling eyes. "I recognize you." The Elven Queen smiled and nodded. "I swear to witness everything," she said. "I also bear witness to everything for him." The fairy lady also spoke in an ethereal and calm tone. "And I bear witness to everything for Woned." Lastly, it was Elaranta. This sage's voice was deep and deep. It was very neutral, but it didn't make people feel uncomfortable. White Mist looked at them. 3 Holy Ones, the 7 Holy Ones have reappeared. Only the Bugas, the dragon, the silver elf, and that person are missing. So you are here for me. Alanta nodded. Brando frowned slightly. He looked at White Mist and realized that the protagonist of this meeting was actually the latter. But it was not surprising that Alanta knew White Mist. They were from the same era. It was just that the conversation between the 4 of them made him feel like he was falling into a fog. He had also heard of the name of the Holy Ones before. That was in a certain background of the game. Legend has it that the sage Alanta kept an agreement with Gretel and Fanzan and walked the earth for a long time, guarding the covenant made by the mortals in the War of the Holy Ones, the sacred oath. She was the Holy Ones, which was why she was immortal. But there was also a period of investigation about what the Holy Ones were, but most of it was unresolved. Brando once thought that it was a special state of perfect body until some people unearthed some remnants of the war slate from under the ruins of Feyran. The inscription on the slate mentioned an incomplete fragment of the Holy Ones. It described a passage, the key of the mortal world, the lock of the clock. Players speculated based on the inscription and some documents that it should be a metaphor for something like clockwork, because there was a similar fragment in the Pale poem. But before he transmigrated, that was all there was to the investigation. However, Brando did not ask and just listened silently. He knew that now was not the time to interrupt. The sage, the fairy, and the Elven Queen were obviously not talking to him. Baiwu silently glanced at the others. "You know. We knew from the moment the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn entered the elemental world." "Miss Tilius also found clues from her knowledge," the Elven Queen replied. "The tree herders deceived all of us. This is the negligence of the Holy Ones. That is why we came to you for help," Alanta also said. Brando could not help but look at White Mist. He did not expect the sage to ask her for help. White Mist looked around at everyone and replied, "It's not your fault." After all, only a few people know the true identity of the baby girl. However, the Circle of Ashes has been planning for this for thousands of years. Perhaps they will succeed. She can't succeed, the fairy replied calmly. Although Gwendolyn deceived everyone, she can't deceive the Twilight Dragon. Odin has already seen all of this. If that's the case, why did he make a promise with you for 1,000 years? White Mist stared at them and asked. Atlanta was silent for a long time. Then she slowly said, because he has been waiting for that person, the destined person in the Pale Poem's prophecy, but that person still failed. The fairy waited for the sage to finish before continuing. The Twilight Dragons will in the baby girl's body is a conspiracy. The Circle of Ashes did not find any relevant words in the documents of the sage. They may have been deceived. Mr. Odin has long suspected that this is the reason why the ancient council did not execute the baby girl. Unfortunately, he did not have time to reopen the Truth Council. The White Mist looked steadily at her, and at Atlanta. If it weren't for you, this wouldn't have happened. The War of the Holy Saints was instigated by Mr. Odin. The Flaming Blade, the Sacred Wind Empress, the 4 holy artifacts, were all given to us by him, Atlanta replied softly. The prophet in the Valley of the Holy Saints was Teacher Tumun, wasn't it? Because he is a fool. Mr. Odin is not ignorant, because he knows that the power of the gods has declined. If the level of order in Wonde is not reduced, the twilight will come. White Mist jumped up as if she had been pricked by a needle. She stared at Atlanta uneasily. You know. I have 1,000 years to remember, and I will always remember those sad memories, Atlanta replied slowly. Mr. Odin stood guard for us for the last 1,000 years. Now that the gods have long left, the mortals will have to rely on themselves to save themselves. She looked at White Mist as if looking at a time in the past. There were many riddles in that time, but they had all been solved one by one. You want to stop Gwendolyn? Stop the twilight from coming? White Mist asked, do you know what Odin paid for this? The Elven Queen was silent. Atlanta nodded. The mortals are not ready for the final battle. We must not let the Twilight Dragon come early. This is Mr. Odin's will. But have you ever thought, White Mist asked, after you die, everything about the past may be completely lost, and the mortals will never have a chance to return to that era. But sometimes, some people have no choice. Like him. Like Mr. Odin, Atlanta replied. Well, White Mist nodded. I admit that sometimes the world does need some fools, but now my ability is limited. You have to come up with a plan yourselves. What are you going to do? The wise ones and I cannot enter the elemental plane. Once we enter the elemental plane, the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn will immediately notice, the Elven Queen replied. We need someone to bring the keystone into the elemental plane. Who? This fairy lady. White Mist shook her head. She can't. She can't pass through the mountain of quenching storms. You'd better find a Termosian to go with me. A Termosian will not enter the mountain of quenching storms, the fairy lady replied. Actually, we have already found a good candidate. Who? White Mist asked. Atlanta, the fairy lady, and the Elven Queen turned their heads at the same time. Brando frowned as he pondered over the meaning of these words, but suddenly he felt the eyes of the 3 ladies fall on him. Chapter 11:24. Are you talking about me? Brando was slightly stunned. The Elven Queen nodded slightly and replied, Mr. Brando, your intention here is to stop the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn and rescue the Roman lady. We have the same goal. As long as you bring the keystone to the Earth Elemental Realm, we will have the opportunity to teleport to the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn's side. We will then have the opportunity to stop her ritual and prevent the Twilight Dragon from descending into this world. Brando's heart skipped a beat, but he did not show it on his face. He asked calmly, Your Majesty, can the descent of the Twilight Dragon be stopped? The Elven Queen looked at Totatila's thumbs. The fairy lady, who seemed to have never woken up, thought for a moment and replied, "Theoretically, it is possible. Gwendolyn may choose to open the three nodes, pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha, pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha, and pi alpha nu delta omega rho alpha, causing the mana to collapse in waves. If we can find the frequency pattern of the third layer's resonance and cut off the 7th to 14th ring points, as long as we can occupy the passage for 4 units of time, we will have the opportunity to intervene in the ritual. The prerequisite is that we must be very close." Brando felt as if he had heard a heavenly book. Even his head felt as if it had swelled up. At this moment, he finally remembered why he chose to be a warrior and not a wizard. The Elven Queen could not help but shake her head with a bitter smile. "Miss Tata, please be concise," she reminded. "Oh." The fairy lady made an "oh" sound and touched her forehead with her hand as if the question had troubled her. But after thinking for a moment, she finally found an explanation that even a normal person with a dull brain could understand. "Simply put, it is possible, but not certain. There is probably no more than a 30% chance. If we can go deeper into the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer to analyze the specific direction of the mana flow, we may be able to analyze which law she is using. Perhaps we can increase the chance of success by 5%. But this will take more time. Do you know the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer? The pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer is the lowest layer of the law of Tiamat. It is composed of a layer of formatted mana. It is, stop." Brando raised his left hand and made a stop gesture, stopping Miss Sprite from continuing her work. He did not want to feel like a primary school student if she continued. "I think I understand, but I have another question. What should I do?" The Elven Queen continued, "Lady Eloranta will make a keystone. Mr. Brando, take this keystone and pass through the mountain of ceasing storms. Enter the elemental world and find the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn and get as close to her as possible. Once we have the coordinates, we will immediately teleport over. And then? Do we join forces to stop the ritual?" Brando asked. He had come into contact with keystones both in the game and after coming to this world. It was divided into two, and it was actually a spatial anchor point that could transmit spatial coordinates in both directions. The royal family of Covardo's fleet used it for positioning and teleportation. However, the teleportation of the fleet required a spatial magnification circle, which was much simpler for Eloranta and the others. The Elven Queen shook her head. "It's not that simple. Once the ritual begins, even killing the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn will not help. It will only make things worse. We have to intervene and interrupt the ritual first. We can only rely on Lady Tilia's calculations. You plan to invade the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer and interfere with the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn's ritual from the direction of the flow of mana." Brando suddenly remembered something when he heard the word calculations. In fact, he was not completely ignorant of mystical knowledge. Although his knowledge of more advanced knowledge and the magic network was almost zero, he still knew some of the basics. The law of Tiamat was divided into 7 layers. The pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha, pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha, and pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha were its lower 3 layers. The pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer filtered the dark mana and transformed it into orderly power. The pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha and pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer were the distribution layers. The former classified the mana, while the latter determined the final flow of mana to the last 4 layers. However, when the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer distributed the mana, the direction of the flow of mana had already shown signs from the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer. However, except for a few scholars who were proficient in the magic network, most wizards could not control the magic network deep into this layer. When a wizard cast a spell, the only thing that determined was the law used and the amount of mana used. The last 3 layers of the law of Tiamat were the law layers. The 4th layer, pi alpha nu delta omega sigma eta, was the calculation layer. Most wizards who were proficient in magic could only go deep into this layer. Only a few could reach the pi alpha nu delta omega sigma alpha layer. Because the law at the bottom had a certain degree of autonomy, there was no need for wizards to waste precious spiritual power. He could not help but glance at the fairy. If the latter had the ability to do so, she would be a genius among geniuses in magic. Throughout history, those who could touch the first layer of the law of Tiamat were all amazing figures. For example, the few leaders of the Silver Alliance. However, when he looked at the fairy, Tata also looked at him in surprise. You've studied mysticism systematically. The composition of the world's foundation was not necessary for apprentices of the law of adepts. Usually, they could only understand the nature of the world after they came into contact with the elemental field. However, this was not a problem for players. Modern technology had ways to directly describe any model for them. Brando nodded and found an excuse. I'm also an elementalist. Very good. The fairy nodded approvingly. It was not clear whether she was praising Brando's solid foundation or praising his extraordinary achievements in so many fields at such a young age. She had already known from the Elven Queen that the young man in front of her was a genuine sword saint. However, in fact, most elementalists did not study mysticism. In Wond, there were many elementalists who did not know anything about the law of Tiamat. Usually, they only needed to have enough elemental affinity. However, it was said that for some old-fashioned wizards, or even wizards who had received ancient legacies, it was natural for all spellcasters to have a systematic grasp of mystical knowledge. It was said that before the Age of Light, wizards had to spend decades learning pure theoretical knowledge before they could embark on the path of magic. At that time, wizards, elementalists, string magicians, and even witches were scholars first, and then the latter. Obviously, the fairy was a wizard who grew up under the influence of such thinking. If that's the case, Brando replied, I may be able to help. I have some ether dragons. They live in the highest level of the Sea of Magic. Their energy attribute is enough for them to easily enter the Medusa stratum. Miss Tata, you should know that ether dragons are actually a kind of mutated magic. You can summon ether dragons. The Elven Queen said with some surprise. If that's the case, the chances will be even higher. Mr. Brando, you've really helped us a lot. Our goal is the same, Your Majesty, Brando said modestly. 10%, the fairy said. What do you mean? If we can use the ether dragons, we can increase the chances by 10%, Tata replied concisely. That's 45%. It's already very high. Brando thought for a moment and asked the question he was most concerned about, but what happens after the ritual is stopped? He knew that stopping the ritual would only interrupt the process of Twilight's descent, but the will of the Twilight Dragon had always left an imprint on the Roman's soul. Even if it didn't erupt this time, it would descend again sooner or later. At this time, the sage finally spoke. This depends on whether the Twilight Dragon can be resealed after the ritual is stopped. How do we seal the Twilight Dragon? What will the Roman do? What about you? Brando remembered the conversation they had with the white mist and vaguely felt that something was wrong. The Elven Queen only smiled at this question but did not answer. Eloranta shook her head. Little guy who is favored by the Saint Tossol, we can only do our best. If we fail, you can take this to that person. The fairy held a sparkling sapphire in both hands. She flew to Brando, looked up at him, and then placed the gem in the latter's hand. Brando looked at the gem in his hand and found that in the center of dozens of geometrically polished surfaces, there was a very beautiful imprint in the middle of the aquamarine crystal. The imprint was like a towering tree, but it also seemed to be some kind of complicated magic circle. It was as thin as a piece of paper and was embedded in the center of the crystal. What is this? He picked up the gem and asked Eloranta, who is that person, sage? If we fail, it will naturally tell you everything, Eloranta replied. This time, Brando seemed to understand the meaning behind her words and couldn't help but frown. If we fail, Sage, what will you do? If we fail, at this time, the white mist jumped back onto Brando's shoulder and whispered, no one will be spared, Brando. Brando was slightly startled and then understood. His gaze landed on the projections of the fairy lady, the wise one of the earth and the elven queen, and he nodded lightly. Then please give me the keystone, he said, but I need someone to bring me to the mountain of calming storms, wise one. No problem, Tada replied. Elder Cobb will arrange the fleet, but if you need a guide to the mountain of ceasing storms, there is actually a better candidate here. P.S. I'm done sorting out my thoughts. The first update is here. The next update depends on whether it will be at noon or in the afternoon. Speaking of which, students, last month's update was pretty awesome, right? Please give me monthly votes. Please give me more. This month, I will be just as awesome. Can I fight for full attendance? Also, I recommend the Silly Moon Breeze's new book, The Silent Crown, but his standards are still very high. You should know it well, so I won't go into detail. Chapter 1125. A better candidate. Brando was a little confused. But as far as I know, shouldn't the Termosai be the natives of the White Cape the most? He said as he looked at the white fog. In theory, yes, or you can say that in this part of the sea. The sprite replied in a flat voice. But it's not necessarily true for a specific individual. For example, I know more about this world than the Termosai. Brando could not help but raise his eyebrows. The sprite was said to have mastered 1/3 of the knowledge of the world's library. In terms of understanding of the shallow sea, even the Silver Scholar, the guardian of the great library of the Bugas, was not as detailed as her, let alone the Termosai. Miss Tada, do you mean that the person is you? But the Dragon Queen won't notice you. The sprite shook her head gently. I'm just giving an example. That person is a guest of the port of Everwinter. You will see him soon. His understanding of the elemental barrier is not much worse than mine, so you don't have to worry about his ability. So, Brando asked, where is this gentleman? Tada reached out and flicked her hand forward. A transparent ripple passed through Brando and spread out of the tent. Then she turned her gaze back to Brando and said, he is at the port of Everwinter. You don't have to leave so quickly. The speed of time here is only a fraction of the speed of the outside world. I suggest you stay and rest. After all, the journey to the elemental world of Earth is not as safe as people think. And I have something here for you. But before that, I suggest you attend a trade fair between ships. As for that gentleman, I will arrange for you to meet him there. A trade fair between ships. Brando asked, is it a Termosai trade fair? Tada nodded. The Termosai people don't have a fixed residence. They drift on the sea all year round. When they meet each other, it's a very precious opportunity for them to exchange experience, see maps, and some necessities. So, such transactions often happen on the light path. Secondly, when the Termosai people meet a planeswalker, they will often inform the nearby ships to gather and hold a bigger trade fair. Planeswalker? Brando asked carefully. In fact, ever since he heard White Mist's description, he had always been interested in it. Putting aside the fact that the Spring of Youth had appeared at the trade fair, he was also eager to obtain some equipment to increase his strength. His trip to the Earth elemental plane this time would most likely involve him fighting the Dragon Queen. Although his own strength was comparable to that of a supreme class, it was still insufficient in the face of a sage's domain. Most of his normal equipment had been destroyed in the battle with Haku for the war slate. So, even if it was the lowest level of magic equipment, he was in a hurry to get himself a new set. Just like how human sailors need to prepare food and fresh water before going out to sea, Tremosai people need to prepare all kinds of pure elements when they travel along the path of light. These elements are not the violent elemental power that the elementalists have mastered, but the basic elements that have been converted into order. Basically, only planeswalkers can provide them. Brando nodded silently. He understood that the so-called basic element was the element produced by his land card. That element was indeed very different from the elemental power of the elemental user gate. It was precisely because he was an elemental user that he knew this better. After the ripples from Miss Fairy's fingertips spread out of the tent's curtains were lifted by a short, fat hand. The Tremosai elder who had led Brando's way previously came in from outside the tent. He first bowed deeply to everyone present, including Brando. It was as White Mist had said, in the eyes of the Tremosai people, the status of planeswalkers was no lower than that of the wise ones, or even the wise ones. Then, the elder straightened his short, fat body and looked at Miss Fairy. "Elder Keb, bring Mr. Brando to the Holy Church for a meal," Tata said to him. "Also, arrange for the fleet. We have to set off before the 7th month, at least through the Sea of Mist before then." The Tremosai elder, who was called Elder Keb, nodded, but his short, fat hand did not leave his chest at all. He only turned his body sideways and bowed to Brando, making a very human gesture of please. Even though Brando did not understand the Tremosai people, he understood that this obviously human etiquette was obviously not something they should have. The elder did this only to express his respect for him. He hurriedly whispered his thanks. But before he left, Brando bowed to the wise ones and the Elven Queen again. This bow had nothing to do with his identity, but was purely to express his respect for them. He clearly understood what they would have to pay in order to seal dusk. "Mr. Brando, I wish you success in advance," the Elven Queen said with a smile. "You will definitely save the Roman lady." Eloranta also nodded slightly, and then the two figures gradually faded until they disappeared. Miss Fairy turned a blind eye to this scene. She just waved her hand gently, indicating for Elder Keb to take the ladder away. The wooden deck of the cabin was narrow and dark, slowly tilting to one side. The sea slammed against the side of the ship, as if it would not stop until the worm-eaten planks were smashed to pieces. The whole ship made a frightening creaking sound, as if it could fall apart at any time. Brando looked through the porthole at the stormy sea outside. The white waves chased each other, forming huge waves that could topple mountains and overturn seas. In the storm, several dragon-headed warships were faintly discernible. Sometimes they completely sank under the waves, leaving almost only a bare mast on the sea. This storm was far worse than the small winds and waves he had seen on the Sea of Naga. Even White Mist's expression was a little solemn. This storm was much worse than the one this lady had seen when she passed through the Sea of Mist last time. The abnormal weather seemed to be indicating something. Only Miss Fias could continue to be heartless, just like the common trait of their race. The little sprite sat on the desk, licking her fingers attentively. She started licking her right pinky finger, and her pink tongue deftly licked all the way to her thumb, not letting go of any corner of her finger that was stained with sugar water. Brando gently put down the knife and fork in his hand as he listened to the little sprite licking her fingers. The fish in the wooden plate was neatly cut and placed on ice. The bright red and clear fish meat was poured with a fermented product made of seal fat and fish eggs unique to the Tremosian people. This dish was called Kusitika, the most important dish in the Tremosian people's biggest festival. The water elemental tuna was rare and difficult to catch. It was the rarest food in the shallow sea and even in the whole of Wonde. The meat of the elemental tuna was plump and tough, with a hint of cold freshness, and left a rich aftertaste. As for the fermented sauce of the Tremosian people, it was a matter of opinion. The sound of horns came from outside the window, and Brendel turned his head. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Tremosian warships emitting beams of light. These beams of light broke through the wind and waves, penetrating the turbulent waves and the dark sea, shooting into the rain and fog ahead. What happened? Howren could not help but ask. The Termosai acted quickly. It only took them a few hours to organize a large fleet. However, the fleet did not head directly to the end of White Cape. Instead, they sailed north. The port of Everwinter had informed the nearby Termosai fleet to attend the trade fair. The trade fair was said to be held in the Bone Sea, a part of the sea north of the port of Everwinter that was shrouded in storms all year round. Brando did not know why the Termosian people would choose such a place for the trade fair. In his opinion, such a trade fair should be in an area with calm seas or at least better weather conditions. However, he rarely guessed the actions of these natives, just like now. White Mist scooped up a shallow sea crab with her claws and put it into her mouth. Waves of rich water elemental energy emanated from under her fur. She closed her eyes in comfort and replied, "We're almost there. They're notifying the nearby fleet. Fleets from other clans." White Mist nodded. Why would they choose such a place to trade? Brendel furrowed his brows as he looked at the storm outside. The dark clouds in the distant sky almost reached the sea, and the dense lightning bolts intersected with the waves, illuminating the sea. It was a spectacular scene, but people who were in the middle of it would not think so. They would only feel that a great disaster was coming, as if the end of the world had arrived. Although Brando was slightly better, he was still not used to it. No matter how brave and fearless the people on land were, they would never be able to adapt to the changes of the sea. Andesha, who was standing outside the door, entered several times. Even Brando could see that the matriarch of the tree herders was uneasy. She had the divine blood of Fenritos in her body, and after turning into a plant, she was more attached to the earth, and even more uncomfortable with the life of a rootless duckweed. Just like this moment, she pushed open the door and walked in again. The ship that Brando was on was not one of the Termosian warships. In fact, the ship called Orbawolf was the flagship of this fleet. Its shape was a little strange, and it did not look like any ship Brando had seen before. It looked more like a platform on the sea, but it was made of wood and reinforced with magic. Because of this, the rooms on the ship were at least spacious. Although the room that Brando brought with him was not as beautiful as his office in Valhalla, it was much better than the dark corridor outside. Andesha's appearance was different from ordinary people, but her sense of beauty had not changed much. She also pursued a comfortable life. Even if she was a little unhappy to be in the same room as Brando, it was still the same. Chapter 11:27. That's the tradition of the Termosian people. They believe in nature and spirits, and they worship powerful natural forces like storms and lightning the most. They usually only trade in the storm, but they are not looking for trouble. The skeletal sea is actually the eye of the storm. It's a very quiet sea. You'll understand when you get there. White Mist looked up at Andesha and answered softly. Furthermore, the storm can block the pirates, the Rogo patrolmen, and the Tuluan whalemen. They are a big problem in the shallow seas. There are pirates in the shallow seas. Brando was stunned. Of course there are. They are mercenaries of the dusk, more or less related to the chaos. Some are even half-dusk species. Andesha looked at the two of them, and then reluctantly said to Brando, "They asked me to call you out, Count of Tonajol." "They? Those damn round fellows." Andesha replied. "The ship group is here." White Mist continued, "As I said before, the Termosian people will work together to pass through the last part of the storm. Before that, we'd better go to the deck. The last time I saw something like this was nearly 1,000 years ago." At this time, the sound of a horn sounded again. Brando looked back and stood up. At this time, a huge wave came from the front, and the Obwolf was thrown to the highest point of the wave, causing the cabin to tilt to one side. The little fairy was caught off guard and rolled to the corner of the table. Brendel hurriedly reached out to catch her, but the wooden plate on the table flew up and a piece of tuna meat accurately hit her little face. With a smack, it stuck to the little fairy's face and covered it tightly. Ugh! Help! Brando was amused as he removed the meat from her face. She was pale and gasping for breath. Are you all right? He asked. Not really. To be exact, it's very bad. I remember that the shallow seas were not like this before. You've been to the shallow seas before? No, but it's all in my memory. It's all the same, you know. Brando nodded. Aside from the fairies, the other three, Brando, Andesha, and White Mist, were able to move as if they were walking on flat ground. It was as if they were not affected by the uneven ground. In fact, the reason why the Termosians were able to sail on the turbulent waves was because of their innate strength and physique. Brando picked up the fairy and walked out of the door. As soon as he stepped out, he saw the short and fat elder Cobb. The latter bowed respectfully to him. Please follow me, Master Planeswalker. His gentle voice immediately appeared in their minds. Brando nodded and followed along with White Mist. Andesha hesitated for a moment before she wriggled her lower body and chased after him. The corridor was pitch black. The seawater that had seeped in from an unknown source flowed on the floor like a stream. Cold droplets of water dripped from the ceiling. It didn't feel like they were on the lower deck of a sailboat, but more like they were in a leaky submarine. The few of them waded through the water. White Mist looked at the water on the ground with disgust and carefully stood closer to Brendel. She raised her claws and water droplets kept dripping from her soaked fur. Then she heard Brendel's question from the side. What are the saints, Mistress White Mist? They are immortals. I don't know the details. I only know that Odin made an agreement with 7 people, and the contents of the agreement were unknown to others except for him and the Witch Empress of that generation. After that, there were 7 absolute saints walking on the earth, and the only one that the world knows is Eloranta. She thought carefully as she spoke, then added, but I suspect that the existence of the saints may be related to Odin's plan. The Dark Dragon's plan? Brando asked in a low voice. I still vaguely remember some of the things that happened back then. Eloranta and the others were right. The 4 holy objects were indeed arranged by Odin. This was related to his agreement with Crystal and Blaze. In that era, the gods went their separate ways. The Earth Legion, the Truth Society, and the Ring of Ashes were no longer as harmonious as when the Truth Parliament still existed. Everyone went their own way, and the Myrnas also had their own plans. But the gods didn't care about it. They started to stay away from mortal affairs from that era. Crystal and Blaze seemed to have other plans, but their plans also came from the War Dragon. The gods used the magic network to contact Odin and signed the agreement with him. The descent of the 4 holy objects, especially the flaming blade Odorfice, was just one of the links. At that time, everyone was involved in this game, racing against time to prove that they were right. Odin knew more than anyone else. For example, the existence of the baby girl. At the end of the Empire, I often felt that he was very confused. He often thought about some problems alone. But what these problems were, perhaps only the Witch Empress knew. However, she never told anyone else. That was their common secret. White Mist shook her fur and water splashed out. She frowned and continued, then, the Empire's beacon rose. A few of Su Yi's human students raised the flag of rebellion and opposed the Empire's rule everywhere. Then there was endless war and chaos. At first, Eloranta and the others were weak and were almost besieged by the Empire's army several times. But every time, they turned danger into safety. It wasn't until the Bugis and the Silver Elves joined the war that the situation was reversed. Of course, before that, the Flame King Gretel's rebel army had already formed, but the Bugha's counterattack dealt a heavy blow to the Empire. From then on, the Empire began to go downhill. Did Odin show mercy? Brando asked. White Mist shook her head. No, he wouldn't joke about the fate of the Empire. Do you know what the Mardos symbolized in that era? It was the empire with the longest history established after the Azure Knight. It represented absolute correctness. Even the Dark Dragon had to respect the tradition and thick history behind this term. But maybe this is the will of fate. The lady sighed. At first, I hated these ungrateful people very much. I couldn't wait for that idiot to kill them all. But later, I also understood that being right for a while doesn't mean that it will always be right. Maybe the Myrnas really went astray. However, in every era, there will always be someone who will stand up to correct the mistakes of history. The divine people and the gods have already foreseen everything. It's just that everyone will have arrogance in their hearts. She paused for a moment. Brando, if one day you become the king of this world, you will too. You're joking. Brando shook his head. I've never thought of it that way, and I'm not that kind of person. You know, Lady White Mist, in fact, Her Royal Highness wants me to marry into the royal family and be the regent of Erewhon before her rose grows up. But this doesn't suit me. White Mist looked at him with a little surprise. I thought you didn't know. So you're playing dumb. That little girl thinks too much. How can Erewhon keep you? But this may not be a bad thing for you. If I'm not wrong, Her Royal Highness should have a place in your heart. That's exactly why, Brando replied as he walked. In the past, he didn't have much interaction with White Mist. The latter was always beside the Roman, sternly educating the merchant lady on how to inherit the throne of the Witch Empress. But now, the two were like best friends, talking about everything. I know what she's thinking. Nothing is more important to her than Erewhon. That's the only inheritance her father left her. She must protect this family business for her brother. But I'm not interested in this. It's because I used to admire Her Royal Highness that I don't want us to be enemies in the future. If you stay in Erewhon, it's almost inevitable. White Mist was very keen to see through the problem. Brando was also silent. After a while, he reacted and said, These are things that haven't been decided yet. I won't become a king, and I don't even care much about the identity of a count. Maybe after all this is over, I'll take the Roman and Scarlet to find the world outside the Black Forest and disappear from this world completely. You're as naive as that person. White Mist laughed. She looked at Brando's forehead, where there was a rune that only an ancient witch like her could see. It was a beautiful crite, shining faintly. If Brando could go back in time, he might still remember the scene when Martha gently tapped his forehead and gave him a pair of wings made of light. The few of them moved forward in the darkness. Their feet were cold, and the icy water seemed to have soaked into their leather boots. It felt like stepping into a muddy pond, and it was unpleasant. After a while, Brando asked again in the darkness, What happened after that? After that? White Mist replied, After that, the Empire fell, and Odin had to fight with the 4 wise ones on the final battlefield. Everything is not much different from what you know. But there are too many mysteries left in that era, and the whereabouts of the Truth Parliament and the Ring of Ashes are unknown. Only Odin knows that the era of mortals has come, and the transitional period of the Myrna dynasty that has existed for thousands of years will finally end in his hands. And the power of order in this world is so weak. The Earth Legion is still fighting the army of dusk outside the elemental barrier, and the world of mortals is like a baby sleeping in swaddling clothes. So he made a pact with the 7 sages. Chapter 11:28. Promise. White Mist nodded. Although we don't know the content of this promise, we can see some clues from Elaranta's performance today. The constant weakening of the power of order should be the plan set by the Truth Parliament, and this is also the reason for the mortal era. But the Truth Parliament, including Odin himself, is fond of the legend in the Pale poem. If a hero like the Azure Knight is born among the mortals, maybe he can decide the direction of the world's fate. Until the last moment, they still hope to return to the past when their parents still existed in this world. The chosen one is the Silver Queen? Brando asked. White Mist looked at him again. Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, Constance being toyed with by the Ring of Ashes means that the last hope of the Truth Symposium's reopening has been shattered, and after the 7 holy sages have witnessed this, it is time for them to correct history. Correcting history. This proposition was so big that Brando felt a little incredulous. Simply put, Odin left a glimmer of hope for this broken world. Otherwise, the war between the Myrnas and the 4 sages would have split Wound into 4 or 5 pieces. In fact, he didn't even call back the Earth Legion that was fighting the Dusk species outside the elemental barrier. On the final battlefield, he should have taken a step back with the 4 sages. He made a wish that lasted for 1,000 years, hoping to prove that he was right. The 7 sages were his witnesses, but it turned out that he was still wrong. That's it, White Mist replied, of course, this may just be my guess. What do you think? Don't you think it's a joke? Brando was silent for a moment before saying, in fact, it's not that I can't understand. I think Lady Elaranta and the others can't judge right and wrong. They just want to overthrow the rule of the Myrnas. The proposition of fighting against the Dusk is too big for them, no, even for the entire mortal world. He raised his head and looked ahead. They stopped in front of a closed wooden door. Outside was the top deck of the ship. The thin door could not block out the sound of the wind and rain outside. Seawater poured out from the crack of the door and flowed down the stairs like a hanging waterfall. The pale white lightning occasionally seeped into the gaps between the wood, leaving a few long strips of light in the dark passage. 1,000 years sounds very long, but it's still too short for this war. Seriously speaking, I'm not sure if this world can fight against the Twilight Dragon. Not to mention Odin and the others, even I think that it might be better to return to the era when the gods were still on the earth. He said softly, the power of mortals is too weak. How can they fight against Dusk? But we can't go back. The gods have already left. White Mist's eyes reflected Elder Cobb's hand on the door as he struggled to push it open. And the time left for us is so short. If Elaranta and the others can't seal the Dusk, the whole world will face this disaster head-on. She paused for a moment. It was as if she could hear the door creaking open and the sound of the storm rushing in from outside. Everyone shivered subconsciously, even Andesha, who was standing far away, was no exception. And even if it succeeds, White Mist's voice was scattered by the wind and sounded a little intermittent, it will only delay the fate of the world by a few decades. In the future, this world will eventually face all of this. The war outside the elemental barrier has lasted for thousands of years. Whether the Earth Legion still exists or what their attitude towards our world is, no one can say for sure. But no matter what, she replied, at least the future is in the hands of the mortals. Is this Martha's wish? Brando murmured. This is Martha's wish. The storm had completely invaded the cabin and drowned out their conversation. The fierce wind turned the narrow cabin into a whistling corridor, and the seawater smashed into their faces. It was as if what Elder Cobb opened was not a shabby wooden cabin door, but a valve at the bottom of a reservoir. The seawater surged in like a waterfall. The fairy in Brando's hand screamed and covered her face with her hands. Of course, it was useless, and she was soon drenched. However, the others were not affected. Before the seawater could reach them, it was blocked by an invisible force. The silver lines of law flickered a few times, and the seawater shattered and fell on the wooden planks, forming circles of white foam. Elder Cable stood tall in the wind and rain, his long robes soaking wet. However, this short and fat Termosian was not affected in the slightest. He was as resolute as a statue. This was the nature of the people of the sea, guarding and conquering the sea. To them, this storm was no different from a summer afternoon shower. Brando heard the sound of horns coming from the front and back. It did not sound like the call of a human sailor, but more like a series of whistles in the heavy rain. Then, he heard the long sound of a horn from afar. A beam of light pierced through the pouring rain and shone from the opposite side. This beam of light connected with the beam of light emitted by the fleet, forming a bright path of light on the dark sea. He stood on the deck and looked at the dozens of dragon-headed warships on the turbulent sea, breaking through the waves along this path of light. He couldn't help but feel a heroic spirit rising in his heart. He could already see the vague outline of another group of ships in the storm. White Fog said loudly to him, "They are using lights to transmit information, informing each other of the nearby undercurrents and whirlpools. That should be the closest group of ships. There may be several groups of ships of this size nearby." "Is that so, Elder Cobb?" Brando asked the Termosian elder in front of him. The latter nodded and a voice rang in their minds. "That's the fleet of the Dense Fog clan. They've just returned from Ferisa. They've hunted an elite seal. That's a good haul. Ferisa is the ice sea. That is the home of the crystal stag," White Fog said immediately. Brando nodded. Malurcha was not on this ship. Divine creatures were born to lead people out of the wrong path, and the crystal stag was the best guide in the storm. Their identity as planeswalkers was only one of the reasons they were so respected. Malurcha's existence was also important. The latter should be on the dragon-headed warship at the front, leading the way for the entire fleet. "How far are we from the place of trade?" he asked again. Elder Cobb raised a chubby finger. "Less than a chain of light. As long as we pass through the skeletal strait, the storm will stop," he said in their souls. Brando didn't know how far a chain of light was, and White Fog obviously didn't know either, so she didn't speak this time. But what Brando didn't understand was why a strait would appear on the vast sea. He looked around. Although visibility was poor in the storm, he could still see the sea level far away on the horizon, forming a line with the dark clouds. There was no sign of land nearby, much less a strait. However, he soon understood what the Termosian elder meant. A strait rose from the bottom of the sea out of thin air. To be exact, it was like a pair of monster fangs. Two pitch-black cliffs stood on the vast sea without any foundation. They were so high that Brando didn't know how high they were. Just the sea between the two cliffs was more than 10 nautical miles wide. The Termosian fleet passed through it, as small as a group of ants floating on the water. Just as Elder Cobb had predicted, the storm on the surface of the sea gradually calmed down after they passed through the strait. It was as if the storm and raging waves had calmed down after a short moment. The white, silk-like waves calmed down, and the shallow sea returned to its original appearance. The surface of the sea was as smooth as a mirror, and as far as the eye could see, the sea and the sky were the same color. The only unpleasant thing was that the surroundings were still filled with a faint fog. Brendel could see that there were many reef pillars in the fog. These huge pillars were spread out on the surface of the sea, and they were covered with all kinds of huge skeletons. Some of these skeletons looked like they belonged to some kind of huge sea beast or whale when they were alive, but some of them were in human form. They were undoubtedly the remains of some kind of giant. When Brando saw these skeletons, he knew that they had arrived at the skeletal strait. This was the center of the storm. The fleet he saw earlier was approaching from afar. The Termosian fleet looked much smaller than the fleet in Port of Everwinter. Although it also had a few large ships, there were much fewer dragon-headed warships on the periphery, and the flagship was far less spectacular than the one in port of Everwinter. The dense fog clan's fleet slowed down a few nautical miles away from the fleet, maintaining a speed that was almost parallel to the Everwinter harbor's fleet. But soon, Brendel saw a warship with a dragon's head coming out from the fleet and closing in on them. When the dragon-headed warship came closer, Howren could see the crew clearly. It was very different from the crew of the port of Everwinter. There were very few sprites or other shallow-water natives on the ship. They were all Termosians, but their attire was slightly different from the Termosians in port of Everwinter. Except for one person who wore a long robe, the rest wore thick fur coats and had different tattoos on their bodies. Elder Cab pointed to the Termosian in the long robe and said, "That is the Elder of the Mist. They are very close to us. Miss Toddy used to study in the Mist clan when she was young, and the Elder of the Mist was half her teacher." Brando nodded. Some knowledge could only be understood outside the home. This was the so-called travel 10,000 miles, read 10,000 books. The fairy knew so much about the shallow sea and was so knowledgeable. Other than being a saint, she must have been to many places when she was young. And for a student to be more capable than a teacher, this was nothing to a genius. P.S. Continue to ask for monthly votes. Chapter 1129. The Horn of Commendation. What's this? Brando asked as he placed his hand on a stone pillar carved with some kind of sea beast. In front of him was a light screen. This light screen appeared from the top of the stone pillar. It was almost the same as his system menu, but the color was slightly different. The system menu usually emitted a faint green light, but this one was entirely pale gold. There was a huge table on the screen, and from top to bottom, thousands of items were listed. Brando even saw rare items and equipment such as the Heart of Ice, the ancient Tethys furnace, the rune wooden ship of the wonderful ancients, and the shadow hull bracers. As for the less rare items such as the Heart of Ice, the elemental potion, and the essence of water, there were hundreds or even thousands of them. This was the trading method of the Termosian people. There were a total of 5 clans participating in this trade fair. They were the Dense Fog clan, the Port of Everwinter, the ICC clan, the Longtooth clan, and the Sea Dwellers of Royas. Most of these clans just happened to pass by this route, or were in the nearby sea area. As for places that were slightly further away, the ships might not be willing to make a trip here. Or perhaps they had already booked the route and were unwilling to easily deviate from it. The pillar that Brando was standing on was the pillar of the Dense Fog clan. Hearing his question, the Dense Fog elder immediately replied, "That is a flute made from the third tooth of a sharp seal. This creature has the ability to control water. This ability comes from its third elemental tooth. Using this tooth to make a flute can control the water element, and even increase one's affinity with the water element." "Can I take a look at it?" Brando asked again. "Of course, respected planeswalker. Place your mind on the item on the disc, and you will be able to see it in detail." Brando glanced at the table again, and couldn't help but be deeply shocked by the wealth that the Termosian people had collected. If the items on the list were real, they could easily build a country anywhere in Wonde. Not to mention a colossus like the Empire, but at least a small country like Erewhon wouldn't have any problems. He sorted out his thoughts and refocused his attention on the sharp seal bone flute. In fact, he was very interested in this thing because there was a sea blue water droplet symbol on the bone flute. This was the holy elemental seal that only the top water elemental items would have. If it was an ordinary top-level elemental magic item, the holy seal would only have half a drop of water. If it was a water elemental artifact, there would be several layers of blue ripples around the water droplet. The more blue ripples there were, the higher the grade of the artifact. The holy seal of this bone flute was a complete water droplet, but there were no ripples. This meant that it was a water elemental holy item that was second only to divine artifacts. In the game, it was the highest level of mythical items. Brando hadn't seen many pieces of such equipment even after transmigrating to this world, let alone in the game. His best equipment was only at the level of mythical equipment. Brando focused his mind on the bone flute. What appeared was not the illusion of the sharp seal bone flute, but as he expected, a familiar menu popped up in the system: Heaven's Order, Hofward's Horn of Commendation, Mythical A+, Defense +1, Bloodline +47, Willpower +35, Perception +22. Hofward's Golden Wine. When the wearer uses elemental power, Hofward's Valkyrie will collect golden liquid and store it in the horn. The wearer can raise the horn and drink the golden wine. Each sip of the wine will restore 35% of HP and increase strength by 12%. Lasts for 15 minutes. The horn can store 10 sips of wine. Full calcification, the wearer is blessed by the ancient Valkyrie. His skin and muscles are as tough as rocks. The wearer gains 25% physical damage immunity. Elemental affinity, wind and water surround you, water and air elemental affinity +10, fire and earth elemental affinity -5. There was a small poem engraved on the horn, Fathers God chose from the crowd, that was a soldier who drank freely and was brave and fearless. He and they, thunder and lightning, rode the wind and broke the waves. The ship floated at the bottom of the whirlpool, and on the waves, the warriors poured their cups and sang, pour the sweet wine into it. That was a soldier who drank generously and was brave and fearless. They brought back glittering gold and silver and jewels, asleep in the land of dreams, under Hofward's tree, the Valkyrie's commendation. Brando was shocked by the attributes. A plus mythical item, this was the highest level of mythical items. It was only a step away from being a demigod item. In fact, in the Amber Sword, there was no real difference between its price and the lowest demigod item. He finally calmed down and couldn't help but ask, is this also for exchange? You are free to choose any item on the disc, esteemed Sir Planeswalker, the Elder of the Mist replied. Brando glanced at the list again and saw that there were a few demigod items on the list. He couldn't help but feel a little dry in his throat. What about the price? He asked dryly. He had to admit that this horn was very tempting, but he also understood that such equipment was also extremely precious in the past game. The more precious they were, the more the price was close to an astronomical figure in offline transactions. He was already a planeswalker, the Count of Erewhon, the Lord of Valhalla, but at this time, he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He didn't have many resources at his disposal, at least he thought so. Master, look behind you. The Elder of the Mist didn't seem to be worried about Brando's ability to pay at all. He pointed behind him and replied. Brando's eyes followed the short and thick finger to the back of the list. 5. Light EP, Water EP, and 5 Wealth EP. Wait, does that mean that this horn requires 10 EP and 5 Wealth EP? His tone was a little hurried, which made the Elder of the Mist a little uneasy. The latter hesitated for a moment before answering, My Lord Planeswalker, do you think this price is too high? It's like this, I think this price can be adjusted. You know, according to what you said, this was the price that we set when we last traded with the Planeswalkers almost 1,000 years ago. It has been so long since the last trade, we may not be too familiar with the market. No, I mean. Brando was shocked by the Elder's hurried explanation. The Elder of the Mist was half a teacher to Miss Sprite, and even Miss Tata was respectful in front of him. He never thought that the Elder of the Mist would talk to him like this. But at this time, the white mist wagged its tail and walked to his feet. It gently scratched his trousers, and then said to him telepathically, Shoo, don't talk. The power level and authority of the Planeswalkers is much higher than you think. Your power comes from the power of world creation. Every element and every resource you create is extra from this world. Mortals value the flow of material and wealth, but this is meaningless to the Termosai. They need increase, so the resources that the Planeswalkers have are unique to them. You mean that the elements and wealth born from the land cards and resource cards are really created? Brando asked in disbelief. To be exact, it's creation, White Mist replied. Planeswalkers are the creators of the world, so there's nothing strange about that. So, you should understand now. Using so much creation power in exchange for a worthless horn, this is not a high price for them. A worthless horn, Brando muttered to himself, and suddenly felt that his values and worldview had been damaged. He turned to the Elder of the Mist and said, I want this horn. As for the specific exchange, you can decide. No problem, Sir Planeswalker, the Elder of the Mist replied respectfully. Brando took the time to glance at his elemental pool. He still had 7 water and light elemental points, 14 wealth, and 7 reputation. He looked at the list with some reluctance. There were 2 lesser divine artifacts, Bow Elemental and Kargatha's Ornithopter, but the price was too high for him to bear. He carefully looked at the list again, and then silently left the stone pillar of the Mist clan and walked to the next ship. This was the Dragon Head warship of the Ice Sea clan. The stone pillar at the front of the warship was carved into a cylindrical crystal. Brando put his hand on the top of the crystal, and in an instant, a list popped up. The items on the list were much less than those of the Mist clan. There was not a single lesser divine artifact, but there were some rare materials. It seems like this clan is much weaker than the Mist clan, but Brendel knew that this clan is the craftsmen of the Termosian people. They are usually more interested in materials, so it's understandable that they don't have many magic equipment. He looked at the list one by one. The richest of the 5 clans was the port of Everwinter, followed by the Termosian people who called themselves the Sea Dwellers of Roas. As for the Mist clan, they could only be ranked 3rd. According to White Mist, this clan had a very short history. They had a tradition of hunting elite seals, which was why they could accumulate so much wealth so quickly. In the end, Brando exchanged for a belt called Rex Hide from the Roas people's list. This was a rare piece of mythical equipment. He had seen it before in the game. This belt had a special effect that increased the duration of Berserk. At that time, it fell into the hands of the world's top Berserker, and helped him win the individual competition in the Crown of Evergreen tournament. In terms of level, this belt was not as good as Hofward's horn, but it was very useful to Brando because the Berserk effect of the War Dragon was also seen as a Berserk effect. Rex Hide, Indigo Belt, Mythical D, Defense 2, Constitution plus 33, Strength plus 27, Dexterity plus 12. Rex Wrath, a thought that is becoming clearer and clearer in Rex's mind is boundless rage. Rage is like a mouthful of sharp teeth that can easily cut through steel. When the wearer activates Berserk, or described as Berserk, or similar abilities, the number of uses per day will increase by 1, and the duration will be doubled. Next was a necklace. Heart of the Waves, Fantasy, Defense 3, Strength plus 22. Chapter 1130. It was a very rare fantasy necklace without any special effects. The reason was that it added 5 points of defense, which was almost comparable to his ancient breastplate, the Crevice of Lonia. Brando chose this necklace from the list of items in Port of Everwinter to replace the necklace destroyed in the battle with White. Although it did not provide elemental affinity, it was very compatible with his class as a Templar Knight. He had never given up on his dream of becoming a humanoid tank. Of course, this was not the best item in Port of Everwinter's list, but he looked at his elemental pool. He had 3 light EP, 2 water EP, 9 wealth, and 7 reputation left. The Horn of Commendation alone cost him 4 light EP, 3 water EP, and 1 wealth. Rex Wrath cost him 4 wealth. The Heart of the Wave was the cheapest, only worth 2 water EP. There were many good items, but his wallet was limited. Of course, the remaining resources weren't that little, but not every piece of mythical equipment was practical, and Brendel wasn't a newbie who hadn't seen the world. There were no impractical divine artifacts or demigod artifacts in the amber sword. Unfortunately, the price of divine artifacts and demigod artifacts was not something he could afford. He glanced at the treasure of Enveranote on the list with some envy. This ring was the top subdivine artifact in the amber sword. It could guide the wearer to find all the hidden treasures in the world, but it had a curse that brought misfortune to the wearer. He wanted it very much because he knew that the world tree root could counteract the curse, and it seemed that even the knowledgeable sprite did not know this secret. That was why the Termosians sealed the ring and set such a low price. Unfortunately, the price was 120 wealth and 50 water EP, which was not something he could save up in a short period of time. Brando could only force himself to look away. He felt a little regretful. This place was a huge treasure trove for him, or for any player. It was a pity that he did not have enough hard currency on him right now. And if he stayed here, time would come to a standstill. He would not be able to use the Planeswalker stage, and he would not be able to create more resources. Once he left this place, he would definitely have to fight with the Dragon Queen immediately. Presumably, he would not have the opportunity to return here for a while. If there's a chance, I'll definitely come back here to mine for gold. Brando thought that although there were not many ways to cross the elemental barrier from Wound, there were actually quite a few, of course, that was under the premise that one's strength had reached a certain level. His eyes searched aimlessly on the list, trying to use his remaining wealth to exchange for a suitable weapon. Now that the Halran Gaia was destroyed, although he still had the Flaming Blade, the Frost Earth Guard was a dual-wielding class. The Termosai people did not seem to be too interested in collecting weapons. Most of their collections were belts and bracers of various types, followed by horns, harps and other musical instruments, as well as a variety of magic goblets. Most of the remaining weapons were axes, hammers, or spears. Brando finally found a sword, and upon closer inspection, he realized that it was the giant's sword. Just as he was about to give up, his eyes suddenly narrowed as an item on the list caught his eye. A shard, mythical A+, bloodline plus 22 lingering chill. These shards came from a divine artifact, and they are surrounded by a perpetual chill. The ice shard reduces the wearer's agility by 5%, and increases the wearer's affinity with the water element by +10. There were a total of 3 such shards. Brando almost instantly remembered what Miss Sidney had told him in East Metz. He looked up at the fairy and asked, "Miss Tata, if I have some questions, would it also count as a transaction?" "The Termosai people do not sell information," Tata replied indifferently. "You can ask, and if there's anything I know, I'll tell you the answer." Brando nodded. "Then I've heard of a legend in Wound. I heard that the 4 elemental orbs were created by the elemental lords in their respective elemental planes. May I ask if there is such a thing?" The fairy was stunned. This question was a little too sudden. She thought for a moment before replying, "There is such a thing in the legend, but the light and darkness elements do not have their own independent worlds. However, the light and darkness elements also have elemental orbs, which more or less makes the legend somewhat untenable." "Does that mean the rumor isn't true?" "Not entirely." A voice suddenly interrupted, causing Brando to look in that direction. He then realized that the one who spoke was the wise one of the IC clan, the wise one of the IC clan. The wise one of the IC clan's voice was transmitted to the hearts of everyone present through telepathy. The ice orb was indeed the treasure of the shallow sea. It did once exist in this world, and for tens of thousands of years, it had been guarded by a group of Termosai people. This group of Termosai people is... Before Brando could finish his sentence, he saw the wise one of the IC clan's nostalgic gaze and suddenly understood. He turned his gaze to the fairy, who nodded silently. Many years ago, about the 5th era, the ice orb had indeed been guarded by the IC clan for generations. Then why was it later forged into a sword? Brando asked. It was not forged into a sword. A second unfamiliar voice sounded above everyone's head. This was a very beautiful voice. It was a little stiff, but with a hint of arrogance, but no doubt it was very pleasant to the ears. Everyone looked up and saw that there was a little one on the mast. He was wearing the most exquisite bloomers and leather boots, but his upper body was only carrying a belt used to hang the scabbard. His fiery red short hair was eye-catching as if it was burning. Brando recognized this little fairy. It was the fire fairy that he and White Mist met at the port of Everwinter. White Mist had also speculated that the fairy had the bloodline of the fire elementals. It was not forged into a sword, the fire fairy answered seriously. It was made into a scepter. In fact, the 7 elemental orbs were all forged into scepters. They are the 7 keys, the bronze keys. Who are you? White Mist looked up and stared at the fairy with some vigilance. She showed her sharp teeth and said, "When did you get here?" "He is Lute Flinders Morningstar." Fias sat on top of Brando's head and replied. How did you know?" Brando asked. He then put his hand on his forehead and realized that he had asked a stupid question again. "I don't know. I just know." The little fairy answered matter-of-factly and puffed out her chest proudly. "Mr. Lute is a subject of Fords, a member of the fire elementals, the 7th successor of Fords, the future," Tada replied. She looked at the fire fairy on the mast and continued, "This is the guide that I've introduced to you, Mr. Brando. He's going to the Mountain of Quenching Storms." Brando pointed at the little one in the air and asked. "I'm going to look for the Scepter of Fire." Lute looked at the black scabbard on Brando's back, the scabbard that Brando had made for the flaming blade, and his eyes were very gentle and kind. "To prove that I have the ability to succeed the Protector. Although Mr. Lute is only 237 years old this year, he is already the strongest sword saint among the fire elementals," Tada added in a low voice. Although they were only 237 years old, the short lifespan of fairies was only in comparison to the near-eternal lifespan of other elemental life forms. Compared to the weak iron citizens like humans, their lifespans were naturally longer than one could imagine. However, there was no doubt that the learning ability and potential of humans were the best in Woned. Here, Brando, who was not even 22 years old, was already a first-class sword saint and was already half a step into the supreme realm was enough to prove it. Therefore, Brando did not feel inferior. He nodded. "So you want to come with us?" "I'm the one who will take you there," Lute corrected him seriously. "Blessed by the flaming blade, I'm happy to travel with you. You are the will of the golden flame. We will get along very well." However, he looked at White Mist and shook his head. "But I don't like your pet. She's too cold. And your servant, she's a little stupid. I don't like people who are too slow. It's hard to communicate with them. I'm not a pet, servant." White Mist and Faya jumped up at the same time. The latter was just retorting, but the former had already lowered her body, showing her white teeth and whining. There was no doubt that this meant something, but Lute did not seem to notice. He sat back on the mast and said to Brando, "Blessed by the flaming blade, I know a lot about the 7 elemental orbs. Is there anything you want to ask?" Brando's scalp was a little numb. He looked at White Mist, whose fur was all standing up, and then looked at the serious fire fairy. He felt that the guide that the fairy had found for him was not that suitable. "Lady White Mist, calm down," he whispered with cold sweat on his forehead. "He's just a child. You are the ancient sorcerer saint. You can't lower yourself to his level." However, what broke Brando's heart was that at this time, the little one on the mast said seriously again, "Mr. Brando, I want to correct you. I'm already an adult. I can be responsible for my own actions and words. I'm not a child. Also, blessed by the flaming blade, under the witness of the golden flame, you and I, as subjects of Forsyth, have a telepathic connection with each other. So, you can use telepathy to communicate with me. He thought for a moment and added seriously, I'm not saying this to warn you, blessed by the flaming blade. I just want to tell you that in the future, if you want to keep secrets from me, it's better to use whispers. Very well, you'd better be responsible for your words. Brando heard a low roar and saw a cold blade shooting towards the fire fairy. It was as fast as lightning. P.S. Today's 2 chapters are available. Please vote for me, students. Chapter 1131. Crack. The gleaming ice blade hit the mast with a gust of wind, causing ice and wood chips to explode all over the place. But Root's reaction was also very fast. He had already jumped up from the crossbar of the mast and dodged the attack. Then Brando heard a series of whooshing noises of ropes breaking. He watched as the ropes tied to the crossbar began to bounce off one by one from where the ice blade hit. Then the huge sail made a rustling sound as it fell from the mast like a white flag, enveloping everyone on the deck. White Mist let out a low growl, and her hair stood up like needles. She was about to launch a second attack, but at this time, Brando groped under the sail and grabbed her. Don't be impulsive, Lady White Mist, he shouted. Get out of my way, I must kill this damn bug today. White Mist let out a series of low growls. This adjective seemed to have angered the arrogant elven gentleman in midair. Who are you calling a mosquito? Root replied angrily. He clenched his hands, and an elemental sword burning with flames appeared in his hands. I'm talking about a bug. That's enough, you two. Brando lifted the sail and rescued Miss Sprite from the ropes. He looked up and saw the flame sword in Root's hand, and finally became angry. This was not a joke. Although his sword would not hurt the people on the ship was most likely going to be destroyed. Brando said angrily, White Mist, you are the ancient witch sage, and Mr. Root, you are a member of Fourseed's clan. Please show some basic tolerance. Of course, he was not just shooting his mouth off. The power of the law of space spread out in an instant. White Mist groaned, and the magic gathered around her dissipated. The fire element in Root's hand was torn apart, and could no longer maintain the shape of a long sword. This is the power of the golden flame. He could not help but show a look of surprise. On the other hand, White Mist pouted. It was unknown whether she was subdued by Brando's violence or moved by Brando's magnanimity. She snorted softly and jumped to the base of the mast, turning her head away and ignoring the others. I'm really sorry. Brando finally had the time to apologize to Miss Fairy. The latter's hair was a little messy, but she just calmly tidied it up. Then, she glanced at Brando, shook her head and replied, It's okay. Soon, the other Termosians climbed out from under the sails. In response to Brando's apology, most of the wise men from the various ships shook their heads, indicating that they did not mind. Only the sea folk of Roa seemed slightly displeased, because the ship was their ship, but they did not show it. Lute flew in the air for a while, and after confirming that White Mist was no longer paying attention to him, he flew back and landed on the mast. He frowned, feeling a little annoyed. In fact, he did not think that he was a person who liked to cause trouble. In the name of the Golden Flame, he did not think that anything he said was inappropriate. At least, that was what he thought. So, he was very angry at being attacked. At first, he wanted to say something back to White Mist, but when he looked at the angry Brando, he finally held back. After a while, the ship was reorganized. The Termosians rolled up the sails and put them back into the cabin. Brando looked up at the fairy and asked, Mr. Lute, can I call you that? You can call me Lute, or whatever you want, the fairy replied. Because you are the Flaming Blade's adorer, you can call me whatever you want. Brando was a little speechless. He wanted to explain that this was a polite question, and not a serious question about what he wanted to call him. He thought for a while and said, "Then Lute, I am very concerned about the previous question. You said that there are 7 elemental orbs. Does that mean that the orbs of nature are real?" In fact, ever since Sydney told him the meaning of the elemental orbs in East Metz, he had been very interested in this topic. The power of the flame orb and the darkness orb in his body had shown an extremely high level of power in the battle with Rushta. He suspected that this power might be related to the legendary existential power, or even the method to create a perfect body for the Iron Folk. But unfortunately, ever since he felt the power of the flame orb in the cold dew manor, Odorfice will seem to have fallen into a deep sleep again. No matter how he tried, he could not activate it at all. Apart from being able to use the flaming blade's power, he could no longer feel the existence of the flame orb in his body. So now, he urgently wanted to know everything related to it. In response to Brando's question, Lute nodded and said, "Because it was never a legend." Brando nodded and did not question it. He also did not ask the question of where the orbs of nature were born if there were no natural planes in this world. After all, such a question was even more nonsensical than asking fairies why they knew the names of their own kind. Although there were only 4 worlds within the elemental barrier, the mountain of ceasing storms, the stone pivot, the scorching river, and the shallow sea, light, darkness, and other natural elements all had their own places of abundance. In those worlds where the 3 elements originated, there was nothing strange about the existence and birth of the nature orb. "You said that they are keys?" Brando asked again, "But I have never heard of this before." "What kind of keys are they, Lute?" "This is related to a secret. If it is not convenient," Brando quickly said, "we can skip this topic." "No," the sprite shook her head seriously, "I mean, although this is a secret, if Mr. Brando wants to know, I will tell you." "Why do you say that?" Brando was a little puzzled. He always felt that this sprite was inexplicably close to him. When he used the power of law to interrupt the sprite's spell, he felt that the sprite's power level was not much lower than his, but she was unusually obedient. Lute thought for a moment before replying, "It's probably because you're the Flaming Blade's adorer. I feel like I can't hide anything from you." The Scepter of Fire, Odorfice, is the supreme object of the fire elemental realm. Although I still don't know if you've inherited the ability of the Golden Flame, I'll test you. Brando had a good impression of the sprite just now, but now he was a little dumbfounded by the word test. He smiled bitterly and said, "All right, as you wish. Then please continue to talk about the 7 orbs, or the scepter." "I have heard of something similar, but I am not as sure as you are." "Those are the 7 scepters," Lute answered with certainty. His voice was like singing a light song, just like the common characteristic of the fairies. "And they are not just scepters, but keys. They are called bronze keys in the Pale poem." Keys. Brando recalled the name Bronze Keys, and he quickly remembered a legend. It was part of the legends of the Highlanders, called the Epic of Arkhen by the mortals, and it told the story of a mortal hero. This hero was not famous in Wonde, but he was the greatest hero of the Highlanders, because he was the first king of the Highlanders. Legend said that he opened the treasure of the Latch of Wa, the treasure of the mountains, and used his extraordinary wealth to build the Highlanders' kingdom. Most of the Highlanders of this era passed down the memories of that era, even Scarlet, who was a Highlander far away from her homeland, was no exception. In that history, the glorious kingdom was destroyed by greed, and the hero eventually fell because of old age. Legend said that he was cursed by the gods, and sank into the ground with his treasure. In the long years that followed, the people of the Empire, the Highlanders, and even adventurers from other races went to search for the treasure of the Highlanders' king, but they all came up empty-handed. Brando clearly remembered that the epic mentioned the key used to open the door to the treasure, and it was described as follows: a rusty bronze key. Rust was verdigris, but the Pale poem often used metaphors to describe history, so it was often difficult to understand its meaning on the surface. The pale poem said that it was the bronze key, and it was very likely that it was an indirect metaphor, that it had some kind of secret connection with the word bronze. Is it the Epic of Arken? He asked. The fairy nodded. Brando suddenly understood. In his previous life, like most players, he had studied the Pale Epic. After all, it was a huge book that completely recorded the endless secrets of Wone's history. Although the mortals only had fragments, it was still worth investing time in. He could now understand Lute's words so quickly because of this. Those keys were only used to open Arken's treasure. He asked again. This sounded a little ridiculous. Arken's epic was only a fragment of the Highlanders' history, and its level was obviously not as high as the level of the elemental scepter. After all, Halran Gaia was one of the most important legends of the Temple of the Earth, but it was only a part of the elemental scepter. But Lute still nodded. Arken's treasure is only a part of this legend. He only got the black orb. I see, Brando nodded. Then what will happen if we collect all 7 keys? I don't know. The fairy simply shook his head and replied with a straight face, there is only one legend, that the gods buried their secrets here. It is a door, and behind the door is the secret that will allow the gods to return to the world. Allow the gods to return to the world. Brando's heart tightened. Chapter 1132. Let the gods return to the world. Brando's heart tightened. If others understood this sentence, they might think it was a secret to return to the era of the gods. But it was different for the players. This was a slogan in the Amber Sword, let the gods return to the world, not to let the gods of Martha return to the earth, but to open a new era and let the mortals ascend to godhood. When the players could perfectly perfect the silver body, then the gods would return to the earth, but this time they would no longer be the gods of Martha, nor the genealogy of Tiamat, but the gods of mortals. Brando suddenly felt that he had grasped the secret, but before he could speak, Faith, who was sitting on his head, couldn't help but ask curiously, but where is the door? This question made Brendel so happy that he almost wanted to give it a big kiss. It was just too timely, so timely that he was worried that someone would see through his intentions. It was not that he was being cautious, but that it was so important that he had to keep it a secret. He did not forget the tragedy of the Slate War, where the wizards put down all their reservations in order to compete for the ultimate secret of the world. But this time, Lute still shook his head. Maybe no one knows. No one knows. Faith was a little disappointed. That's boring. History itself is serious. Lute felt that his authority was questioned and frowned. He said loudly, and it's not that there are no clues, at least I know someone who knows the secret. Who? A Myrna man named Odin, but he died a long time ago. Isn't he still dead? Faith curled her lips. But Brando interrupted her and said, the Dark Dragon. Lute was very annoyed that the damn ice sprite went against him, and he replied angrily, it's him. Not only do I know that he kept this secret, but I also know that he gave the secret to another person before he died. He continued, although I don't know who that person is, I know that he was a mortal who built an empire on the ground. Later on, this mortal died, and before he died, he passed this secret to one of his trusted subordinates. This person must be one of the 4 sages, and it can't be Elorante, Brando muttered. He then asked, what's the name of the empire, Fanzin or Saint Tossol? Or Cruz? I don't know, but I know that this empire is related to the relatives of the fire elementals. That's Cruz. Brando immediately made a judgment. Lute, how do you know these secrets? This knowledge has been in my memory since I was born. We fairies pass on our knowledge in this way. If we know something, we know it. If we don't, we don't. If you ask me how I know, I can't tell you, but I know my memory won't lie to me, Lute explained seriously. Bloodline inheritance, Brando understood. He asked again, what happened after that, do you know who that subordinate is? I know this, because the previous protector of Fords once summoned him. That human is called Venter. That was the first generation of the Kindred Knight. It is rumored that he disappeared, and his inheritance is incomplete in the Empire. A voice came from another ship. Brando turned around and saw Andesha appear in that direction. He frowned. He did not like this woman, and did not want her to know these secrets. You can go below the cabin, he said to Andesha. Lady Andesha, when we reach the mountain of ceasing storms, I will inform you. You don't have to worry that I will leave you behind, I still need you. This was an obvious threat, and Andesha also heard it. She gritted her teeth. But this time, she did not compromise. She stood there and said, You will need me soon, Count. You had better let me stay. Brando looked at her silently and did not insist. He asked, and then, Lute? Lute only looked at Andesha for a moment before he looked away in disinterest. He continued, I only know that after 4 elemental eras, this person's descendant left the Empire with this secret. 1 elemental era was 150 years. Brando silently calculated the time and suddenly asked, Where did this person go? I don't know. What about the direction? Lute shook his head. Brando frowned, but Andesha continued, He went to Erewhon. Brando suddenly turned around and looked at the woman. He went to Erewhon, Andesha continued, At that time, that place was not called Erewhon. Erewhon is a foreign word in the Cruise language. At that time, that place was called Valhalla, which is a word used by the mountain people. It means the resting place of heroes. Erewhon, the wise sage of the frozen sea of the Termosian people, ruminated over this word and suddenly said, I think I've heard this word somewhere. It's not a noun, Miss Tata shook her head, it's an adjective that means solemn and sacred. It's usually used in sacred places like burial grounds or temples. She paused for a moment before continuing, This is the language of the Matatanians. The language of the Matatanians. Brando subconsciously repeated. It is indeed the language of the Matatanians. They were the first generation of planeswalkers in Wonde. The pixie lady confirmed, although I've never come into contact with these great entities, I have memories of their language and knowledge, the language of the Matatanians, the language of the planeswalkers. Brando repeated. He could only feel his heart pounding. In fact, the players in The Amber Sword had always known that Erewhon was a foreign word in the Cruise language, but they did not know which language it came from, nor did they know what it meant. But today, he finally understood that it was a word from the Matatanian language. It meant sacred. And the Matatanians were planeswalkers. This name was given by the late King Eric, but the late King Eric was definitely not a planeswalker, and there was no record of him using the power of a planeswalker. He was not even a wizard, nor was he an elementalist, even though he was on good terms with the Silver Wizards of Buga. The name Erewhon actually hid such a huge secret. Brando felt dizzy. He suddenly realized that perhaps the name was not given by the late King Eric. If the latter left the Empire with the secret of the Flame King, then as the descendant of Venter, he must have some kind of mission. This mission may not be as simple as just establishing Erewhon. Why did the late King Eric take a part of the Holy Sword Odysseus when he left Cruise? Was it just to represent the will of the Golden Flame to resist the oppression and decay of the Empire? And he always understood that the Holy Sword Odysseus was actually the Flame Scepter. For some reason, Brando suddenly remembered a lot of things for a moment. Erewhon's many relics of the saints, the many underground ruins, and even the many top-level dungeons in the game, and the azure lance buried under Ampere Seal. And Ekis, sleeping in the loop of trade winds, and Valhalla. And the chronometer under Tonagel, and the crystal that sealed the Witch Queen. All of these were concentrated in Erewhon's small territory. He inexplicably recalled what happened when he returned to Bragg's for the second time. He remembered his strange meeting with Viscount Terst, and the things that he saw at that time were between the lost names and ghosts. He faintly felt that the secret that the other party wanted to tell him at that time might be right in front of him now. There may be a great secret behind the name Erwin. What do you know? Brando suddenly understood what Andesha said before, and asked coldly, Madam Andesha. About as you guessed, Andesha replied, Count, the existence of Erwin is very special. Not only do we know this, but they also know this. Brando knew that she was talking about was actually All for One. Is this why you are so active in Erwin? More or less, that's just one of the reasons, Andesha answered quickly. We are active there, sometimes not to subvert, but to find this secret. In fact, they are much faster than us in this regard. You should know that they have infiltrated the nobles. Brando did not care about what would happen to All for One, he only asked, what is the secret? Andesha shook her head. Who knows, maybe the Bugas will know better. They have many observation points in Erwin, and there is a floating city of the silver folk north and south of Erwin. The meaning of their surveillance is self-evident. And they began to get involved in all aspects of the kingdom at the beginning of Erwin's establishment, and there are even their descendants in Karsu. You mean the wizards of the tower and the Bugas also know about this secret? Andesha nodded. Brando frowned. He did not expect there to be such a relationship, but the Shire should know about the composition of the wizards of the tower, but he had never told him about this. The conversation between the two was fast and urgent, and the others around them were silent. You have been operating there for hundreds of years, and in the end, you have nothing. It's not that we have nothing. We guessed that there was something sealed under Erwin. We found an entrance in Yenbao, and All for One found an entrance in Erech and Brags. Yenbao. Brando's mind suddenly flashed with Dilferi's face, and he recalled everything that happened in Ampere Seal, the crystallization disease. The term flashed through his mind. Chapter 1133. If I'm not wrong, Erech's entrance is in the underground city of Alto. The underground city of Alto was the largest underground ruin in all of Erwin in the Amber Sword. It was an open map divided into 7 floors, and the area below the 7th floor was ruled by a distorted will, which was said to be the will of the evil god Andonio. But as someone who came from the era after the year of the astrologer, he knew that there was a seal of time below, and it was said to be a new dungeon that would be opened after the end of the War of the Slate. Andesha nodded. Then what about Brags's entrance? Brando asked again. It's in a legendary holy relic near Fortress Reden, but no one has ever seen it before. Around the year of the croaking frogs, there were strong magic ripples that seeped out from under Brags, and that was how All for One detected it and calculated it. The year of the croaking frogs, is it referring to Brags's catacombs disaster? Brando immediately asked. If he didn't remember wrongly, the history of Bruglas's great catacombs started from this disaster. So, it's also All for One who led Brags's government to clean up the undead in the catacombs. He suddenly realized. Andesha nodded again. Brando thought of Madara again. Bramante's Black Rose invaded Erwin, but only claimed Butchie. Was their goal also the holy relic? He couldn't help but feel suspicious. In real history, All for One only began to collude with Duke Erech after the War of the Black Rose. If it was understood that after losing Brags's entrance, they turned to seek Duke Erech's support, it didn't seem unreasonable. What kind of secret is hidden beneath Awin? Why would so many factions want to find out about it? Brendel thought to himself as he tapped his forehead. What kind of secret is hidden beneath Awin? Why would so many factions want to know about it? It was really puzzling. Are there only 3 entrances? He asked. We suspected that there might be another entrance in Randner or Tonajul near the loop of trade winds, but... Andesha replied. But I interrupted your plan. Not only that, the Cruz Empire's plan cannot be delayed. We can't afford to wait. Brando nodded. He had already thought of Tonajol when Andesha mentioned Yenbao. He had not forgotten the seal of time beneath Kelsey's tomb. In fact, he didn't expect that a simple question from him would lead to such a topic. After thinking for a while, he finally decided that when he returned to Tonajol, he would definitely go back and meet the dear Demoness. If possible, he even wanted to enter the seal to take a look. He had a vague feeling that there might be some problems here. But before that, he looked at Andesha and asked, "Aren't you afraid of being punished for telling me this?" "We thought that you knew," Andesha replied without changing her expression. "But I don't know," Brando replied. "There's no benefit for you to tell me this now, is there?" Andesha's gaze shifted to White Mist. She hesitated for a while, then retracted her gaze and replied, "I have a few questions." Brando looked at her warily, taking in all her small movements. He replied, "Is this what you want in exchange?" "I can guarantee that my questions will not harm your interests, Count Andesha." "I can't guarantee that," Brando shook his head. "Do you still think that you're trustworthy, Andesha? You should know better than me what kind of organization the tree herders are." "That's why I took the initiative to tell you this," Andesha replied. "I believe in your character, Count Andesha." White Mist suddenly turned around and asked, "You want to know about the Ring of Ashes?" Andesha was slightly startled. She looked at the ancient witch's spirit with some hesitation, but she nodded in the end. "Agree to her request, Brando." "You mean, Lady White Mist, I agree to this exchange, and I also have some questions for her. I hope that you can listen to them." White Mist said. "I agree." Andesha hurriedly replied, as if she was afraid that White Mist would go back on her words. Brando looked at her suspiciously. He did not know what this cunning woman was up to, but he believed in White Mist's thousands of years of experience and nodded. "I know what you want to ask, little girl, but this isn't the place to talk. Let's find a place to talk later, but before that, it's best if you don't play any tricks." White Mist leaped up and landed on his shoulder. She raised her prismatic eyes to look at the Rotten Lord and said, "I know what you want to ask, little girl, but this isn't the place to talk." Andesha looked at Brando with some fear and nodded silently. At this time, the fairy waited for the three of them to finish their conversation before she finally spoke with a calm expression. "Mr. Brando, were you talking about Erwin?" Brando was startled and looked at her. "Miss Tata, do you know something?" Only then did he remember that she was a supreme saint. According to White Mist, this fairy lady should be a witness who had lived for thousands of years. If Eloranta knew something, then she would at least know something about it. As expected, Tata replied, "I do know something about Erwin." Brando immediately turned his attention and asked eagerly, "Then Miss Tata, do you know the real reason behind Erwin's establishment?" The fairy nodded. "My understanding of Erwin happens to be related to this matter. In fact, Sage Elanta knows more about the inside story. This is related to their agreement with Odin, but I only know a small part of it." She continued, "Because when this kingdom was established, it was also an important event worth recording in the shallow seas. Behind the establishment of this kingdom, there was at least the support of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, the Holy Cathedral of Wind, and the Bugis. The Holy Cathedral of Fire. Mr. Brando is a subject of Erwin and should know the history of this kingdom better than I do. At the beginning of its establishment, the war with the Crews was actually a war between Erwin and the Crews royal family. If the nobles of Crews had the full support of the Holy Cathedral, it would obviously be much more difficult for Erwin to gain an independent status." Brando nodded. At that time, Erwin led the rebellious people of Erwin out of the empire with the belief of the Flame King and established a kingdom in the Black Forest. In essence, he challenged the majesty of the Crews royal family. Not to mention, he also took away the fragments of Odorfice. So the war between Crews and Erwin was ultimately led by the royal family. But if the Holy Cathedral spared no effort to support the royal family, then the people of Erewhon would have to face the entire empire. Under such circumstances, even with the support of the Wind Elves, the final outcome would be difficult to predict. The Holy Cathedral of Wind and the Holy Cathedral of Fire could only be said to be equal in power, but the ancestors and nobles of Erewhon were far from the power of the nobles of the empire. And the inaction of the Holy Cathedral at that time had already explained everything in itself. Brando had never thought about this before. In fact, there was no need to think about it because this period of history had little to do with the players. But now that Tata mentioned it, he immediately understood. Seeing that he understood what she meant, Tata continued, the Holy Cathedral of Fire made their stance clear, the Wind Elves spared no effort to stand on the side of Erewhon, and with the secret help of the Bugis, Erewhon was able to be established. But why did they do that? When the Empire lost the war, shouldn't it be the prestige of the Holy Cathedral that was damaged? Faya asked again with a puzzled look. For a lady of the fairies, she did not care about the atmosphere or the occasion. If she was curious, she would ask, this was their etiquette. At this time, Brando understood. Without waiting for Tata to answer, he took the initiative to explain, so after the war, Erewhon was still a country that believed in the path of the golden flames and did not lean towards the faith of Saint Tassol. I have been neglecting this point. Is this some kind of compromise, Miss Tata? Tata shook her head, I don't know much about human politics. Maybe it is. But I don't quite understand, Brando interrupted, what is the motive of the Holy Cathedral of Fire? It is to bring the holy sword Odorfice out of Cruz, Tata replied with certainty. To bring the holy sword Odorfice out of Cruz. Why? Because before Lord Odin died, he told the four wise ones that the mortal kingdom would eventually decay and fall, and history would repeat itself. He could not see the hope that Martha spoke of in the Black Iron generation. Tata replied calmly, for this reason, the four wise ones made a sacred oath to keep the hope and faith of the civilized world. The dragons and the Bugis also witnessed this oath as participants, and have been carefully upholding the terms of the oath for thousands of years. Is this what he promised you? White Mist suddenly stood on Brando's shoulder and asked. The fairy nodded. Lord Odin knew that the defeat of the Myrnas could not be reversed. After all, the root of the disaster had already been planted, and the war started by the four wise ones was not as unjust as the Silver Queen imagined. Lord Odin could see this future, so he compromised with the four wise ones, and he also knew that the Black Iron people would one day embark on the same path. Chapter 1134. Because the fall of mortals is almost inevitable. White Mist continued, the black dwarves are creatures that fell into the mortal world. That's why they are so heavily influenced by the dark magic. The weak and powerless mortals are the most ambitious and greedy among the descendants of the gods. The numerous holy wars in their history and the change of power in the kingdoms built by the four sages all prove this, the sprite nodded. What is he worried about? The descent of the Twilight Dragon. Why is he in such a hurry to find someone to inherit his path? White Mist asked. But civilization has existed for 6 eras, and we even achieved a rare victory in the last war. Why is he in such a hurry? I don't know, Tata replied. Maybe it has something to do with the war outside the elemental barrier, or maybe it has something to do with Lady Martha's oracle. Like the other sages, Alanta and I are actually very clear about the problems that mortal civilization may face, so we agreed with Lord Odin to become the Holy One and stay to inherit his path. Brando silently listened to the conversation between the two before asking, is the Flame King also a Holy One? Lord Flame King is not, Tata replied. Among the four sages, only Lord Alanta stayed to protect the world they created, but Lord Gretel understood that the Holy One only existed to deal with the enemies outside the elemental barrier, and the civilized world must ultimately rely on itself. In fact, he was also very clear about the bad habits of humans and elves, and also knew that Lord Odin's words might eventually come true, so he left a will before he died. If one day the successor of the empire could not inherit his beliefs and will, then the family guarding the Holy Sword would take the Holy Sword out of the empire and go to a pure land to build a new country. This country is Erwin. Tada nodded. But Erwin can't escape the cycle of the mortal world, can he? Brando even recalled Erwin in The Amber Sword. The once glorious kingdom was even reduced to ashes under the ravages of the undead. On the surface, it looked like it had fallen into the hands of foreign enemies, but in reality, it had also fallen into the corruption of the nobles within the kingdom. In this era where elite politics dominated everything, the elite nobles were often the first to fall into self-destruction, causing the entire kingdom to be on the verge of collapse. In this case, wouldn't the Flame King's efforts be in vain? He might be able to lead Erwin's glory for hundreds of years, but the faith of the Golden Flame would one day be covered in dust. History was undoubtedly the best annotation in The Amber Sword. But this time the sprite gently shook her head. I don't think the Flame King simply wanted to continue the faith of crews in a new land. Erwin built the kingdom for the Holy Sword Odorfice, and the Lionheart sword that sealed its soul as its faith. The kingdom will fall, but this sword will stand on this land. What's the difference? Odorfice stays in the crew's empire, and it won't be harmed in the slightest. The difference is the land. Tada corrected him, this land is special. Not only the Holy Sword Odorfice, but also the Halran Gaia, the Frost Chant Sinna, and the Azure Lance. Aren't they all sleeping on this land? And the will of the mountains and rivers. Brando thought and added silently. So what's so special about this land? He asked again. The sprite looked at him and did not answer the question. But Brando understood what she meant. You don't know either, Miss Tada? He asked. Indeed. Perhaps, Tada said. I only know that Lord Odin has entrusted this secret to a group of reclusive silver folk. Maybe you'll have a chance to get the answer to this question from this group of silver folk in the future. The reclusive silver folk. This sentence could only make Brando think of a name, and that was the Silver Elves. Shortly after the War of the Holy Saints, they suddenly escaped into the mountains and forests. He asked carefully, are they the Silver Elves? This time he got an affirmative answer. Brando felt a little thirsty. He did not expect this secret to involve the Bugis and the Silver Folk. All the abnormalities of these two Silver Folk after the war seemed to have a reasonable explanation. It was just that he did not know the explanation yet. He seemed to see a huge ice floe floating on the surface of the water. When he thought he knew enough, he found that it was only the tip of the iceberg. He finally calmed down, but felt that the answers to all the puzzles seemed to have finally come back to the original point. Originally, he just wanted to find the door to the true perfect body through the secret of the seven-element scepter, but now it was obviously a little beyond Brando's expectations. He found that the Holy Sword Odorfice, the Sword of the Earth, the Frost Chant Sinna, and the mountains and rivers seemed to have some inexplicable connection with Erwin, his second homeland. Perhaps it was more than that. Because he also knew that not only did Erwin have the above holy objects, but the dark orb hidden in his body at the moment was also one of the components of the seven-element scepter. These components were inexplicably gathered in this small kingdom. What did this mean? Brando felt his mind in a mess. The answers to the questions that he thought were simple and clear suddenly seemed to have become a little complicated. It was as if he had vaguely grasped some of the questions, but they were scattered and independent, like fragments that were difficult to understand. He was silent for a while before he finally came back to his senses. In any case, this was not his main concern at the moment. The situation on the Roman side was still unclear, and there was still a dragon queen to deal with in Shirshu. Brando felt that he had to put other things aside and focus on the problem at hand. After all, if dusk came, no matter how big the secret behind the kingdom of Erwin was, it would be meaningless. After figuring this out, he recovered from the previous shock and quickly sorted out his thoughts. He glanced at Miss Sprite and Lute, and said with a dry mouth, "I have one last question about the Scepter of the Elements." "Just say it, Mr. Brando." Miss Sprite's emotion seemed to be unaffected by the previous conversation, and her voice was as calm as warm water. "As far as I know, the 7 scepters of the elements were lost on the earth, and most of them did not maintain a complete form. Among them, the Scepter of the Mountains was divided into 2 by Himalud and turned into 2 sacred artifacts of Gaia, Halran Gaia and the Scepter of the Mountains. The latter included the scepter and the orb, while the former was damaged thousands of years ago. Odorfice was also divided into 3. The Orb of Flames and the Flaming Blade were still in a broken state until not long ago, and until I repaired it, in fact, it was still missing the scepter part." He paused and continued. "What I want to ask is, were they separated by someone, or were they scattered and lost due to forced reasons?" "I'm not too sure about the specific reasons, but I can be sure that it was both," Lute answered him. As she had returned to her area of expertise, the little sprite spoke quickly. Perhaps it was related to the War of the Last Era. In some of the recovered documents, there were actually some relevant introductions. For example, as you said earlier, the Scepter of the Mountains was divided into 2 by the Temple of the Earth due to an oracle of goddess Himalud and was hidden in the mountains. So, this legend is true. It should be credible. I also have relevant information in my memory. Brando nodded silently, a little excited in his heart. So, since these sacred artifacts were separated by someone, does it mean that they can be reassembled and repaired under certain conditions? Maybe, but it's difficult, Miss Sprite said. Mr. Brando, didn't you also repair the Holy Sword Odorfice? That being said, Brando actually did not want to hear the answer, because repairing the Holy Sword Odorfice was not so much a repair, but a recasting. After he got the approval of the Orb of Flames and the Golden Flame, he recast the precepts of the sword. But this kind of thing was too illusory, and in the Amber Sword, there was a saying that the divine artifact and the player were compatible. His beliefs and ideals may just be compatible with the Flaming Blade, but it was too outrageous for a person to be compatible with 2 precepts. Not to mention the fact that ice and fire were 2 completely opposite extremes. Well, Halran thought for a while and replied, "But the way I repaired the Holy Sword Odorfice is a little special. I mean, is there a more physical way?" His words finally made the others on the ship react. Almost all the Tremosians looked over. Even Tada's eyes lit up slightly. It was the first time her expression had changed. She looked at Brendel with some surprise, or perhaps it was more accurate to say that she was pleasantly surprised. "Mr. Brando. You mean?" Her voice was a little unsteady. "What's wrong?" Brendel was taken aback by her sudden change of attitude. "What I mean is," Miss Sprite Tada was a little incoherent. She replied while gesturing. "You have another holy sword on you, other than the Holy Sword Odorfice and the Sword of Earth, Halran Gaia, the components of the elemental scepter." Tada took a deep breath and looked at him steadily. She added, "Please answer my question seriously, Mr. Brando, because this is very important." Brando felt the gazes from all around him. He was confused, but he knew how to answer at this time. He thought for a moment, and then silently pulled out the frost-chant Sinna from the cave. After a moment, he heard the sound of gasps around him. "Sinna, sort of the shallow sea. P.S. I've been writing a little late recently. I've watched too much of the TI5 competition. But Stepmother and VG are really awesome. I'm so happy. Tomorrow's IG Battle of Life and Death. If nothing goes wrong, Secret should win with a score of 2 o'clock. I'll commentate the finals with the strength of acting Emperor. Also, there's a small bug in the previous chapter. A reader reminded me that the meaning of the name Erwin was mentioned in the previous chapter. But I remember that I made the relevant settings at that time, but I don't remember the specific details. But it's not a big problem. The meaning should be about the same because the plot was buried long ago. I'll go back and make some changes tomorrow. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.